We're live. All right. Welcome, everyone. I don't know how many people are waiting currently for the live stream to start, but welcome to the persecution shunning conversation we are going to be having about LGBT in an international European context, as well as discussing the ex-Muslim solidarity for LGBT rights. We have a number of special guests, some wonderful panelists, and before we dive into our various topics, we have about 4 topics to cover, as well as some intermissions that include poetry and some other visual aids. Maryam is going to welcome us into this event. So welcome, Maryam.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Maryam Namazie. I'm the spokesperson of Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain. And really, I just wanted to thank our brilliant speakers. We're really happy to have really such wonderful activists who have been working for many years in defense of LGBT rights and human rights. And I think this is going to be a great opportunity for us to really speak together and try to move our movement forward and work together more closely. I think one of the issues for us as ex-Muslims is that whilst we have differences of opinion with those of our friends who are Muslims, and they have differences of opinion with us, we've got to see how we can, despite our differences, and and of course we can discuss our differences. We will most probably be discussing them today. That despite any differences in belief, that we are really one in our movement for LGBT rights of Muslims and ex-Muslims across the world. And of course, I think the fact that LGBT rights is very much linked to the right to apostasy and blasphemy and women's rights and so on. So these rights are all very linked. So I'm really happy that we'll be speaking on these issues. We started joining Pride in London since 2017, and of course this year, because of this awful pandemic, we haven't been able to march, but we're happy that we're doing this as some sort of public manifestation in defense of LGBT rights. And finally, what I wanted to say is that we want to use this platform to commemorate a wonderful lesbian activist, Sarah Hegazi, who died by suicide almost 2 weeks ago. That is Sunday. Sunday will be 2 weeks that she died by suicide. She was someone who really shone a light on these issues, and till the end she was fighting for the rights of everyone, all LGBT across the world. And we definitely want to raise the flag for Sarah today, to remember her and to pledge that through our work, all of our works, that we will continue in her footsteps, and we will continue to raise the flag and defend LGBT rights across the world, but particularly our focus is LGBT from societies that are Muslim majority or communities that are Muslim majority. So again, welcome to our wonderful, wonderful speakers. And I think, I really look forward to hearing all of you. And thank you, Fay Rahman, for chairing this. So I'll leave you now to it.
All right. We're going to start by playing a video around Sarah Hegazi, and I will let that play.
Understand what's going on.
Hegazi sat down. The power of this image is likely lost on many Canadians. A lesbian photographed at a Cairo concert in 2017 waving the rainbow flag, a symbol of gay equality. But for it, Sarah Hegazi was arrested by Egyptian security forces, interrogated, tortured, and imprisoned.
My mental health was disaster. It's like I'm like zombie. I don't understand what's going on.
Hegazi sat down with CBC News in 2018, Convicted in her country of inciting debauchery, international officials helped her flee her beloved Egypt.
استهدى بالله وهات فاطمة.
Toronto was safe for her, but she desperately missed her family.
I was not anyone here. Just alone, completely alone.
Haunted by her past, she suffered with anxiety, panic attacks, and had attempted suicide. Friends say Saturday she took her own life. Hegazi was imprisoned in Egypt alongside one of her best friends, Ahmed. He also raised the rainbow flag at that concert and fled to Toronto with Hegazi.
For everyone who needs help and support, Sarah was the most kind and the most supportive person you might ever see. She was fighting a lot, but she just like lost her energy.
وهرجع أقول إني أنا مش بركز على حالي بس.
During our 2018 interview, Hegazi says in Arabic she wants the focus not on herself, but on the hundreds of thousands jailed for opinions or sexual orientation.
The only thing that we can do to Sarah is to complete what she did, to still asking the Egyptian government to stop arresting LGBT people, to stop torture people in jail, to stop what they do. We just need to live as any human being. That's our right. We are not asking for too much.
Toronto's Rainbow Railroad helped Hegazi and 11 others get out of Egypt in 2017.
It's hard to know that she was struggling. We had conversations about that struggle. And it just highlights the need for additional mental health supports for not just newcomers, but many people in Canada.
The lead singer of the Lebanese band whose concert Hegazi was photographed at with the pride flag just released a song quoting one of Hegazi's previous posts. In Arabic, he sings, "I want the sky, I don't want the earth. The sky is more beautiful than the earth." Sarah Hegazi was 30 years old. Chris Glover, CBC News, Toronto.
So that was the story surrounding Sarah Hegazi, and it's a real shame that she's taken her life at this age, but we will be discussing all of the traumas and the shunning and the persecution that exists due to this. It's really hard for me to talk. Like, I just watched that, and this is all fresh because Maryam sent me this yesterday. But I will bring on some of the speakers to take the pressure off. So on the first panel, we will be talking about international LGBT experiences and rights. And to join us in this discussion about persecution and shunning will be Lilith, Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed, and Nemat Sadat. I would like to request that everyone introduce themselves and what they do. So if we start with Lilith and then go clockwise.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be with you guys once again and talking on the issues, in the international issues about LGBTI people, and especially coming from a Muslim background. So I'm Lilith. I'm originally from Pakistan, and I'm living and working in Germany since 8 years. And I work for the Lesbian and Gay Federation in Germany for the project Queer Refugees Deutschland, which is a project about refugees and asylum seekers in Germany. And most of the people who come to us, they are, of course, international people. They don't come from the European mainland. But since last 2 weeks, we are also getting a lot of questions from Hungary and Poland. We will talk to that, talk about that maybe in the Europe one. And my basic work is to do the consultation on asylum seeking processes and help them getting integrated in this country. And the people who come to us, they come from all backgrounds, from Muslim to non-Muslim background, ex-Muslims as well as Christians and people who are atheists. but mainly they come from Muslim majority communities in Muslim majority countries. Thank you.
Okay. And Nemat Sadat, can we please, first of all, welcome. I don't think we've formally met. I have met Lilith. I met Lilith last year in Amsterdam. But I don't think we've formally met. So who are you and what do you do?
Sure. My name is Nemat Sadat. I'm the author of The Carpet Weaver, which is the first coming-of-age tale about a gay Afghan refugee. I'm originally from Afghanistan. I left Kabul when I was very young, and I returned back to my homeland back in 2013 after 32 years in exile to be a professor at the American University of Afghanistan. And immediately when I arrived, I received persecution by children of these warlords or drug lords who were my students, who basically were cheating and wanted their gentleman's A's and want to go to get a Shunning scholarship and go to UK or get a Fulbright, go to US. And when I was not succumbing to the pressure, they started spreading rumors that I was a lapsed Muslim and a practicing homosexual. And I thought to myself, I can be a coward and leave or just be silenced. But living there amongst the repression, I realized that, I'm in a privileged place because I was able to leave this country and had, maybe compared to rest of typical average LGBT person in the United States, I've had a lot worse. But compared to almost everybody in Afghanistan, I've had much more better time. So I would say that I took this initiative to just start promoting LGBT rights while I was on the ground, meeting with members of the LGBT community, finding out what are ways to promote it. And we did it through many mechanisms. And basically, I was persecuted. I was forced to leave Afghanistan. And basically, the university said that if I were to return, they would criminalize me for basically subverting the social order of Islam. So in August 2013, I decided to just basically come out of the closet as gay, and then the following year as an ex-Muslim. And since then, I've been campaigning actively for LGBTQI rights in Afghanistan and Muslim communities. And really in the West, after the Orlando massacre, Omar Mateen allegedly being a repressed homosexual, it's still, a lot of issues whether he was or wasn't. But being from Afghanistan Muslim, it was the first time that, the West really cared about, hearing me out on this issue of LGBT rights in my homeland and other part in the Muslim world. So I appeared on CNN with Christiana Manpour, and I was no longer a fringe voice. But my novel is the same thing. I've experienced the same thing where my book was not published in US or UK, but I had to go all the way to India right after it decriminalized same-sex relations with Section Code 377. And since then, I've been promoting, through my book, I've been reaching out to the LGBT community there.
All right, you've done a lot of work. I'm actually quite overwhelmed by how much work you've done. But thank you for that introduction. Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed, again, I'm not familiar with you. This will be the first time we meet, at least in an online sphere. And I've heard of some of the work that you've done in terms of building an inclusive mosque and such, but I don't think there's anyone that can introduce you better than yourself. So please do feel free to introduce us as to who you are and what you've done.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. So my name is Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed. I was born in Algiers in North Africa in 1977. Then we flew away during the Civil War, and we're living with my family for 25 years now in southern France, in Marseille. I founded an inclusive queer Muslim community in Paris in 2010, then an inclusive mosque in 2012, where everybody was welcome to lead the prayer, to call for prayer, and so on. And lately, back to Marseille, we founded the Kalem Institute, training, publication, welcoming refugees, providing shelter, administrative or psychological counseling, and working within that intersectional local network called Houses. We work with intellectuals, with theologians from different backgrounds, with artists also to help to provide counseling and support, and also just empathy and friendship to people who might be concerned by the topics that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of heavy stuff, a lot of really empowering activism from everyone here. So the topic today is all about international LGBT rights. And we will be talking about it within the context of Islam and Muslim countries and the culture that surrounds that, as well as the law systems in some of these countries. I think that it would be an interesting discussion to open with any personal stories in terms of shunning, as well as discussing factual information for how these countries internationally look upon people within the LGBT community. So anyone who would like to start, feel free to comment.
Sure, I can share my experience. So,
Okay.
like I was living in the United States, and when I went back to Afghanistan, I met with members of the LGBT community who basically had no idea where to start from. Like, they knew that basically the condition that Afghanistan is very precarious for LGBT people. It's not so clear cut. Let's say, for example, like if you're in Brunei or Iran or Saudi Arabia, where it's like you're going to get the death penalty if you get caught, right? In Afghanistan, publicly, it doesn't. It's supposedly conforming to universal human rights. It's a transitional democracy, but members of the LGBT community there really don't have rights. In addition to this liberal constitution, they have. They have to abide by Sharia law, which basically tells a gay person you can be killed. So they can become victim of an honor violence. The government can persecute them. Police routinely go ahead and fine or rape members of the LGBT community, and nothing. There's no recourse. Absolutely nothing. And so there's this double game. Like there's two people that I know that escaped this dragnet of the National Director of Security, which is funded to go clamp down on terrorist activities, but they were redirecting funds to go tap into groups to find gay and bisexual men to like demoralize and break down these these groups, and doing this what is kill and dump policy, like luring them into honey traps, into like these young seductive men who are working for the government saying, look, we'd like to take you to a date, and then really what they're doing is taking them off, driving them off to somewhere in the desert and killing them off and disposing of their bodies so that it never gets covered by the Western media. And if an LGBT person is so lucky enough in Afghanistan to escape to come to Europe, often the judges will tell them, you know what, you come from a democracy. Look, America liberated Afghanistan, and we know that's not true. Okay, and so then they send them back. Or recently in Austria, there was a case that an Afghan man, they told him, you're not gay enough. Well, it doesn't understand the culture. Gay and bisexual men, for example, I mean, I can give examples of transgenders too, but I mean, they really have to conform to this militantly patriarchal culture. Even if they are LGBT, they have to act like they're, manly enough.
Extremely masculine, yeah.
That's what they're socially conditioned to. So we have an Austrian judge telling them that you're not straight enough. Or a Belgian case manager who's reached out to me, said, look, you need to help us because so many straight heterosexual men from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from other countries in the Muslim world have come into Europe in the last 20 years or more, saying that, look, we're members of the LGBT, please give us asylum. And then years later, they find the government tracks these people and find that these people married the opposite sex. So they either lied or they weren't like not really legitimate. So they ruined the chances for legitimate LGBT people who are now fleeing because it's become even more hostile. So these are serious issues. In the UK, I mean, they basically sent them back saying, look, if you just go, there was one case that the judge said, if you go back to Afghanistan, just pretend to be straight and you'll be fine. But is that a way that you tell an LGBT person? It's just like to live a double life, a fake life for the rest of their life. So these are the kind of issues they face. And for me, like I said, I came from a very privileged background. I came from the most liberal, progressive strata of Afghan society. But most of my relatives rejected me. They had nothing to do with me, other than my sister and my mother, who have kept a continuing relationship with me. And now that I've become successful And because I'm widely known as this author in India, and and like now it's like Vogue India wants to cover me. Now it's like it's glamorous to know this relative who was, that faggot a few years ago. But now it's like, who are we to deny him if the rest of the world is celebrating him now? But it's not really the kind of love and sympathy that I want. How many people are, suicidal just like Sarah? Like they need help at the time they're going to the struggle. I face dark and lonely days. So for people to come now into my life, now that things are much better, I really have to take that with a grain of salt. So those are the situations, my personal journey. I mean, I think more than my personal journey, I think it's really important to really talk about the people who are not heard, who are basically silenced into non-existence right now. And so I think I'll just stop there and give Lilith or Ludovic an answer.
Yeah. I did want to comment, but for the sake of time, I think I'm going to give the speakers more time. Lilith, so you have this very wonderful infographic in the background. You really came here prepared. So please do educate us. What is the map that you have behind you?
So I have the ILGA international map. It's about the laws which criminalize sexual orientation in the world. So you don't have to see me. Like I can I'll show you the map here. We have all the countries of the world, the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, and then we have Oceania. We are now here in Germany and in the UK. So first of all, let me explain the colors. So you can see the key here. The bluer it gets, the better it is. But it's all about the laws, the policies, which are already in place so that you can get protection from the state. It's not a protection from the society that we have to keep in mind. And then you go on to the other side. I'm sorry, I'm standing up. You have the extreme red one, which means the death penalty, which says that you will be penalized to death, or you will be put into jail if you are not being executed in countries like Pakistan, maybe, or even Bangladesh. It doesn't matter. But for the rest of your life, you will have to sit down in jail and maybe get raped there from other inmates for the rest of your life. I don't know. Being labeled as faggot. Sorry for the word, but that's how it is. I'm sorry about it. If somebody feels hurt. So what we do is we cater the needs of the people who come from these countries. You have African countries. In Africa, there's a thing that you have Muslim majority countries, then you have Christian majority countries, and both of them evangelical especially. They don't even protect the rights of LGBTI people. So you have to understand this thing, that there are some patriarchal issues, and religion being one of the key factor all around the world, that it does support patriarchy, because religion needs men to die for, I don't know for what. It's happening since eons.
Virgins.
Then it's a very manly thing. You don't have prophetesses. You always had prophet who was a man, and maybe he was I don't know, on drugs, LSD, something, having visions, and then talking about things which we don't know if it were true or not. Anyways, but in most of the religions, the people have criminalized or made it a sin to be a homosexual person or even trans. Anyway, so we help these people to come to Germany and settle down, and we also work closely with the authorities and also sensitize them about the issues that Nemat already told us about, like if you are gay enough or if you are not gay enough, what does it even mean to be gay, or who are trans people, who are inter people, because trans and inter people also get mixed all the time. That's another thing. And yes, we have cases where people do get rejected by the judges on the basis of, I don't know if this is a real case or not. Is it based on reality or not? Because Iraq has been, if you see, Iraq is yellow. because thanks to US, they invaded Iraq and then they brought their democracy there, which we know, as well as from Afghanistan, there is no democracy there. But if you come from Iraq, it is being perceived that you can safely live in Iraq because the laws, they are not affecting you. But what about the society? What about the tribal lords? What about the people who get killed by their own families and nobody, and I mean literally nobody, reports those cases as violence against LGBTI people? Those cases are reported, there was a fight among the family members and he got killed or she got killed, or honor killing, for example. There are so many lesbian women who get sentenced to death by their own tribal members, and it's an honor killing, and you never know that they were lesbians. There are gay men who get killed by it. There are trans women. I know, I'm from Pakistan, so I know a lot of trans women who get killed by their own family members, and you cannot even go to the police and talk about it as a trans person because your passport says you're a man. And you're not even registered as a trans person there. So even the statistics, we can't rely on that. And then what we see in Europe especially, and it's not just because the Islam is at fault, it's because mostly the patriarchy in relationship with Islam and the way the Islam is being practiced there in different countries, that we have to take into account. We can't just close our eyes and always blame the religion is there. It's always many factors who are affecting why people act in a way they are acting. For example, the best example we have is the Section 377 being decriminalized in India. We know the Indian gods were all LGBTI gods. We know stories about the Indian gods where gods are having sex with other gods who are men. And then gods changing the form from man to women and woman to man. But it was also the colonizers who brought us the 377 section to us. But in Muslim countries, it's just not only the colonizers, it's also still the religious impact, the clergyman, the one who is deciding what kind of sins are allowed in the society and what kind of sins are not allowed in the society. So you have to be very careful about it. And then when the people are taking decisions, especially about the asylum seekers and the refugees in Europe, you have to take into two things in account. One is the EU directives, the national laws of any country. And then you have to see the country of origin. What does they have in place? Can they really protect the person or not? If they cannot, then we come into play as LSVD, the Lesbian and Gay Federation in Germany. And we also provide letters for these people about the situation of LGBTI people in those specific countries. So I'm also telling more about my work because I really want people to know that we can support you about it. But as far as the social dynamics are concerned in a country, it has to come from within. We cannot do too much from sitting in Europe about the countries' situations within their national borders. And thankfully, the nation states, you are independent to decide whatever you want to decide in your borders. And nobody is going to say, oh, look at you. What are you guys doing? We can criticize all we want, like the Belgian Prime Minister did when he went to Cairo. And I really liked it that he did that. But it's just a criticism. And we know Sarah Hegazi, she was also from Egypt, and she committed suicide, which is saddening, which is extremely sad. I wish she was here and we could have talked to her.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was extremely informative. And I think that a lot of these statistics and a lot of the way that the world is mapped and the way that the world works is kind of lost to some of us here who live in Europe or in the States or in Australia. I do want to pass the conversation now on to Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed, as he's had quite a journey growing up in Algiers and then moving to Paris and then setting up his mosque. What kind of first-hand or experience would you share with us about your personal journey as well as what you've learned around the time with you working in this area.
Yeah, so when I was 17, I was studying to become an Imam in a madrasa, in a very conservative Salafi madrasa in Algeria. I discovered I was gay watching a French TV program, and I discovered that I was not the only one in the world, so I was very happy about that. I was also very stressed about the fact that this is not allowed in our traditions, in Islam and so on and so forth. So when I came to France, I tried to be both at the same time, discovering homosexuality, my sexuality myself, and practicing Islam. Of course, it was impossible. It was very stressing. It was depressing. I was thinking also, like Sarah Hegazi, about suicide because it was too hard. And I was telling to myself again and again, I will never be able to survive in such a world. And it's not about myself being abnormal, whatever, because I always trusted I was a good person who could be a good person. But it was about, yeah, the others, especially my family, my friends, my background. So I left Islam very violently because I rejected everything in Islam, in the Arab culture. I decided that my life has to be in France. I took a French name and the French nationality, and I was very, very motivated to make my life here without looking back at my roots. Then a few years later, 7 years later, I started feeling something wrong about that new identity, because I was like more in peace with myself, and I was studying for my PhDs and so on. So I was like more able to reflect about what happened to me, that trauma in the civil war and the threats from some of my uncles, and the physical violence and verbal violence from my father and elder brother and so on. So I said to myself, now you're like studying, you're working, you have your own apartment. So this is supposed to be life. And still you're feeling that a piece of yourself is empty, or at least censored by yourself for years, because you're not allowing yourself to look at that anymore. It was so stressing. So I went to Tibet to do a pilgrimage, to meditate, and Buddhism is so nice and so peaceful, and this is not a religion, and everything that we hear about Buddhism, and that's very, very interesting. That taught me so much about spirituality. But then I started asking questions, because I didn't want to be fooled once again. So before converting or whatever to Buddhism, I asked, what about women? What about homosexuality? So homosexuality was a perversion, and women, maybe one day they will be reincarnated into a man body, and maybe one day they will become a Buddha. So I said to myself, that sounds very Islamic to me. So maybe I should not give it a try. And that's how I got back to Arabic poetry that I was missing, and some Arabic philosophy, and finally to the Quran. And when I started reading the Quran again, I didn't read it like a political message anymore, like a Sharia, like a political Sharia law, but as a spiritual Sharia, which is a path in Arabic, not a law, not a burden, where everything is haram, forbidden. But a Sharia is a path towards spirituality, elimination, paradise, whatever you name it in different cultures. So that's how I started to understand that maybe there's a difference that we all have to, we believe or not in God or in Islam, whatever, between those using religion, nationalism, capitalism, colonization, globalization to get more power and money on the back of others. And of course, we're talking about straight, heterosexual, man, cisgender, whatever, name it. And those who are really trying to make of spirituality, philosophy, economics, culture, art, and so on, a factor of emancipation for all of us. And I started understanding that there's such a huge part of our Islamic history, whatever it is, because it's so complex and old and whatever, but that we are not looking at anymore since the early 20th century, which is also the time of the first colonizations in the Arab Muslim societies. So there's no coincidence here. So I started linking colonization, submissive identities, racism, and so on and so forth, coming from Europe at the time where Europe was considering homosexuality and trans identity as a crime, as a perversion, to what happened to our societies, moving from homoeroticism and inclusive poetry, talking openly about women's sexuality, bisexuality, trans identity for centuries, to very conservative patriarchal societies. So there's only a few exceptions. In northern India, in Uttar Pradesh, for example, one king at that time, when the British Empire came, they started criticizing them, telling them, you all faggot, sorry for the word, and you're all effeminate and you're not viril enough, and we're going to teach you how to be men and to rule your own country. You know the story. And that king was one of the only one in that part of history who decided to take a feminine name. He invited a homoerotic poetry style. He started dressing like a woman from their point of view. And that was kind of an affirmation of his own culture, identity, a bit provocative and so on. But that's one of the only exceptions I heard of in our recent modern history. Generally, when a given society is attacked, they react by producing more virilism, more heteronormativity, more discrimination against sexual, religious, linguistic, ethnical minorities. It happened in Europe during the Second World War, and the Nazi did not believe in God. So I started once again moving to a lower level of analysis and trying to identify the common points between all those fascistic, heterosexual, patriarchal ideologies throughout human history lately, during the 200, 300 years. And I started building bridges between what is happening to African, Indian, and especially Arab Muslim societies. And then lately, we published books about what is happening to LGBT plus individuals in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. And that's very interesting because the situation is almost not the same at all. Meaning that in Algeria, there's so much oil and gas and resources that the country is like an open sky gel, like people there used to say, and still talking about it like that nowadays. In Morocco, the kingdom has given, and they've never been colonized, neither by the European countries, neither by the Ottoman Empire in Morocco. So that more than 1,000 years old history has given that country more stability, but also a kind of conservatism that is very subtle, very, very hard to deconstruct. And in Tunisia, they have been educating the people, men and women, since the 19th century with the Sadiqi school all over the country. So now we have a country that is about, also just like India, Jordan, and other countries like that, about to decriminalize homosexuality and recognize same-sex marriages, at least those established abroad. So as Lilith said very wisely before, we have to take all of that into account, because Islam and the Arab culture, the African culture, the South Asian culture, it's a historical fact, has been used lately to justify patriarchy and the fight against colonization and so on and so forth. But that's not enough. We have to look behind the scene, because the facade might be nationalistic or communist or Islamist or whatever, but what is going behind the facade is always the same mechanism: building a fascistic patriarchal order between the hands of an elite, self-proclaimed elite, man, of course, and on the back of minorities. And that's what we call in social psychology, that's what I discovered lately, infrahumanization of minorities in times of crisis. So that's an animal instinct. We tend to build borders and close doors and discriminate scapegoats and start fighting others, and that generally ends into genocides or civil wars. And that's not related to a given culture, or given period of time in our human history. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, trying to work on that representation of Islam that is causing so much harm, but at the same time, not forgetting that the problem is not a given culture or given religion, because we find the same processes going on for centuries in other cultures, in other periods of our human history, trying to really understand what is causing those discriminations, those fascistic patriarchal dynamics built on the back of sexual, ethnical, and religious minorities.
Thank you. There's some feedback coming. I don't know where it's coming from. It might be Ludovic's. All right. Thank you, Ludovic, for providing that much-needed context. I'm sure there are points to further discuss and further debate within the context and the history that you've provided. And I would like to grant maybe a minute or two to that, to anyone who wants to discuss anything that's been stated further. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So if there is anything that you want to, intro discuss, please feel free to. So Lilith.
Yeah, there's one factual thing that I wanted to correct. Nazis did believe in Christianity, and because of that, they were also persecuting Jews. And we had a very famous saying here in Germany, which is KKK. Everybody knows that, which means Kinder, Kirche und Küche. It was actually for the women, that they need to have just children. They need to work in the kitchen, and they should go and pray to the God for their sins. So but that was just a factual thing. Other than that, everything what Ludovic said is, I agree with him. It's absolutely right, and it has its roots in all the factors. Similarly, as well as in Russia and all the Central Asian states that were part of USSR before that, they still also bring in the religion as one of the factors to discriminate against other minorities, and that's where the problem is. Thank you.
I don't know. Okay, I think Nemat wants to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something about what Lilith was. I really appreciate what Lilith described, that the attack, the persecution is not only at the state level, but at the societal level is particularly, which I also talked about the family. And one of the things, particularly in a country like Afghanistan, where you have militant groups, where the US is trying to reconcile peace with the Taliban and ISIS is trying to make a comeback. And in many countries across the Muslim world, this is another huge factor that we need to take into consideration too, that these forces. And one of the things, while I do understand that, people want to go back in time to the history, I know that I know the sentiments that Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed was expressing, going back at this, the golden age of Islam and the spirit of Islam. But let's be real, we're not going to have a society where you have Sharia law and gay marriage side by side. That's never going to happen. The fact of the matter is, apostates, homosexuals, and women are going to be second class in any Islamic society. I don't care what it is. And I'm not trying to make Islam point out it's bad. Of course, we pointed out Christian theology. If we look back in medieval times in Europe, it was the same way. And also even state atheism. In the Soviet Union, it was it was a state atheist society, which is communist society, and they also persecuted homosexuals, and even it's lingering to this day. I mean, let's remember when I had this huge debate. When I protested about what Russia's doing and its inaction in Chechnya, and I had a lot of Trump supporters like, oh, that's a Muslim problem, that's Sharia, that's Islam. Well, yes, technically, but technically Chechnya is still part of Russia, and Russia is not really helping anything. Putin doesn't care about homosexuals any much that the Islamic militants or groups in Chechnya do. So I think it's very important to let's have a candid discussion, because homosexuals and apostates are always going to be criminalized in any kind of Islamic society, whether it's based on Sharia, puritanical based, or even a loose interpretation, a spiritual interpretation. I really don't foresee the Muslim world, falling under umbrella of a Sufi interpretation of Islam and embracing LGBTQI rights. So we have to find a way forward where it has to be a bigger umbrella where even Muslims can fit into that society as well, but also LGBTQI people and apostates.
Okay, last and final comment from Ludovic, and then we will move on to our first intermission.
Yeah, I think that Lilith, you're very, very, very much right about the fact that it's very, very hard to put, to draw a clear cut line between religion, culture, art. Everything is about human creation. That's what culture is defined as in sociology. But the fact is that Hitler, when he wanted to take the Jews, to destroy the Jewish community in Roma, for example, he thought at one point kidnapping the Pope, because and that Pope was very much criticized also because he didn't say loudly enough about Hitler taking the Jews from out of Roma and sending them to extermination camps. So in that case, you see an atheist leader that was not into church and so on and so forth, about to destroy the Catholic Church leadership just to be able to sacrifice all the Jews in Roma. So what I mean, if you take some distance with those events, it's very hard to put essentialist categories on those dynamics and to say it's always going to happen like this. But if you go to a lower level of analysis from a social perspective, it becomes not simple, but at least a bit clearer to understand that those guys, as you said, both of you, Nemat, also, have nothing to do with spirituality or well-being or nationalism. They just want to grab more power on the back of minorities. That's generally how it happens. And something also you said, Nemat, very interesting about the fact that Sharia and gay-friendly dynamics will never live side by side. Yes, of course, because Sharia is a 20th century invention. Imagine that kings and sultans and whatever for centuries were fighting like men know how to fight for more power, more money. They were not going back to the palaces and giving the keys of the power to the imams. So what happened in the 70s in Tehran and then in other countries like Saudi Arabia and so on never happened before. Historically, it's the first. It's a first. So let's not forgive, as you very well put it, Nemat, that Middle Age. Up until 1830s, so 19th century, they were burning alive sodomites and transgender people in front of the city hall in Paris, in London, and so on, while on the other side of the sea, sultans and khalifs and so on and so forth were writing homoerotic poetry. They were criticized by the French intellectuals because they were sodomites and so on and so forth, but they were very powerful. The Ottoman Empire was the biggest empire in the world at that time. So I'm not looking at that as a golden age because they were like marrying so many women and they were having sex with young boys without their consent. So I'm not looking at that as a golden age. I'm just looking at those dynamics, what changed, why, at what moment, and what kind of solution do we have to build all together, we believe or not, whatever our ethnical background is, in order to find very effective solutions for the future. Otherwise, in 20 years, unfortunately, we still will have to face the same dynamics, and we will have more and more, peace be upon her, Sarah Hegazi and other activists exhausting themselves, fighting back a problem that is so intersectional and so complex.
Thank you. And thank you all for such an insightful and enlightening conversation. I'm sure many people will take away, thoughts. I'm currently trying to process everything that was said. But thank you for this discussion on, LGBT rights on an international scale in the context of Islam and Muslim countries. And also for sharing, deeply personal anecdotes of the things that you've experienced within that. We will be saying a very short goodbye to these current panelists to welcome Halima Salat onto the scene. Welcome, Halima. I'm going to unmute you so that you are... I can't unmute you. Welcome. Please do feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Halima. I live in the Netherlands. I'm originally from Kenya. My ethnicity is Somali. Somalis are 98% Muslim. And I'm gonna read a poem or spoken word piece that's mostly how LGBT issues have personally affected me. I'm straight, but I'm a huge, huge supporter and ally of LGBTQ folks. My poem is called, spoken word, is called A Boy, a Village, a Death. And so I just get right to it. Is that okay, Faye?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Please do jump right into it once you're ready.
Okay. Now, yeah. There was a boy. There was his family. There was a village. There was a sheikh. There was Islam. And then there was this boy. His memory grievously entangled itself as a rope around his neck. Around his neck was a rope, a loss, a life not to be lived. There was a boy, and this boy, he was my friend when we were teenagers. He was funny, weirdly beautiful, wildly queer. Allah didn't approve. The community didn't approve. The sheikh didn't approve. His family didn't approve. The village didn't approve. His entire being disapproved, rejected, and shunned. And so the rope, it landed on his neck. Somewhere inside, I felt the tightening of his life, not to be lived, and I can still feel the ripples of his tragedy causing me pain, robbing me of my life, of my friend over and over again. You know, back then, there was no word for it. There was no word for who he was. In my language, they called him Nag Nag. It kind of means something like woman, woman, or double woman, meaning he was not normal in their eyes. But in my eyes, he was just a funny kid. He was so hilarious, weirdly beautiful, wildly queer. Here comes the memory of the rope again. The rope around his neck, that rope, me robbed, him gone. Back then, there was a sheikh. There was the family. There was an entire village. There was a fuss. There was them. And then there was us. He made me laugh. He made me laugh so hard I could not stop. I was naive and ignorant, and he was unsure of his own body. But always we had fun, laughing and talking and giggling and running. Him smiling his gorgeous smile and his electric laugh. And yes, sometimes he was confused, but oh, so lovely. He told me, I don't know why, but I feel nothing. I could not verbalize that I knew he was different. I knew that was okay. He was my friend. That rope, the rope tangled around his neck. The rope, the pain, his face, all horribly gone now. Every minute, every moment, every memory is a union of that rope and his character. The rope is painful. His character was beautiful. The day they found out is another vivid, haunting memory. They bit the crap out of him, and the boy next door too. They told my parents I wasn't allowed to hang out with them too. To remember, there was a village, and in this village, there was a sheikh, and there were whispers. There was a boy in that village with his family and their sheikh within Islam, and his name was Abdi. His name was Abdi. I just want to take a moment to breathe and to also dedicate this piece, this spoken word piece, to Sarah, because I feel like it's quite apt as well. You know, when I saw her story, it double affected me in a way. It's quite, you know, it's like the memory of it's something that has touched you personally, and then you tend to grieve that extra, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's not much that I can offer in terms of a condolence, but it is deeply striking, especially since she was so young. She was about 30 years old. So it's understandable that would really affect you.
Yeah. I couldn't even share it on social media. I was like really struggling. I mentioned to a couple of friends, but I was really struggling how to articulate what I felt. I don't know if you're bringing me back for another interlude, or do I read the second poem right here as well? I'm not sure.
Please do. Please do. I am keeping an eye on the time, and you're good for time. So please do continue.
Okay. So this one is called "What the Hell? Islam's Homophobia." It's also just quite like a story of sorts, and it goes like this. They tell them to be ashamed. It's a sin. Never, never named. It's their choice. They are blamed. It's a curse, they are told. Shunned for being who they are. Targeted for loving their mate. Islam's homophobia, by the way, dates way back to that leader who thought it was an abomination to be born this way. You must do a transformation. You can't live this way, for Islam does not accept you. Lives are struggling to make sense of their nature and their nurture, and made worse by Islam's dictates. Today, it's suicides and homicides faced by people who just want to love and to embrace and to have intercourse and to live. Islam's homophobia says it's a sin. Love is a sin? Love is a crime? Islam says so. It kills people. But for what? And for who? And why? It says it in the Hadith. It says it in the Sharia to throw humans off buildings. But for what? And for who? And why? And mums and dads rejecting and shunning and ashamed of their own flesh. Shame, shame, shame for loving and for embrace and for intercourse and for happiness. Islam's homophobia has no place in this year, in this century, in this world. Keep your religion if you must. Believe in your God if you choose. But you leave my fab people alone, man. That's it.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those very emotive and personal poems with us, and it was great to have you, Halima. But I don't know if I'll have you back on, but we'll see. But now we're going to have interviews with Jimmy Bangash, Khakan Qureshi, and Saima Razzaq. And they will be, I don't know where Jimmy is. He's okay. They will be talking about LGBT rights and the LGBT movement for Muslims and ex-Muslims here in Europe or the UK, since we're all based here, but the West. And we're going to be talking about shunning and survival. So to go in a clockwise order, Saima, would you please introduce yourself? What do you do? Who you are? And we'll take it from there.
Hi, thanks for having me here, guys. My name's Saima. I am the chair of an organisation called SEEDS, which stands for Supporting the Education of Equality and Diversity in Schools. We came to life last year, where many of you may have seen there was anti-LGBT protests outside schools in Birmingham. The news reported it as a Muslim majority, Pakistani majority, who actually did become the most vocal. It started off with a Christian group, and then, yeah, just like wildfire. So I myself am a queer Muslim. I'm in a very privileged position where my family have accepted me. Over the last year, I've become very public. Pretty much everything I do is out there. But I have the support of my family, and even when it's been difficult, you know, I've managed to talk to them, and you know, it's very positive. So I know I'm in a privileged position, but you know, that's part of what we do. I also run a floating hotel in Birmingham, so I'm on the boat now. It's called Boatel Birmingham. I'll pass it on to someone else if you want, or I can keep going.
Khakan, please do introduce yourself. I'm aware, like your work is sort of in my periphery. I don't pay so much attention to LGBT issues. I usually focus on free speech and ex-Muslim stuff. But I have seen some of your tweets and some of your work in my periphery. But please do feel free to introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do? You're muted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse my seating position. We've recently moved house, so I have no chairs or anything, so I'm sitting on the floor. But anyway, my name's Khakan. I've been around for a number of years, and I set up Finding a Voice in 2014, which is specifically for South Asian LGBT at that time. But since then, it's obviously evolved a little bit, and we also have non-South Asians in there and people with and without faith. This led me to write about my personal experiences, and for some people, I've now become a role model within the South Asian gay Asian community. I also, like Saima, I was very vocal about the LGBT protests last year as well. I've met Andrew Moffat, Sarah Hegazi, who are the epicenter of these protests, and I've met Shaquille and his acquaintances as well in amongst all this. So we were trying to challenge the narratives that was being portrayed in the media about how the media was portraying it as a sort of white versus brown Muslims narrative, when the reality was it was much more nuanced than that. And I tried to sort of pin it down to say that this is not about religion per se. This is more about people's attitudes, and we were looking at traditions, culture, and religion, and how we were trying to separate the three of those particular issues. It was very challenging in itself, but it broadened that discussion that I've always wanted all my life. I always wanted people, especially the Muslim community, to discuss homosexuality within Islam. It wasn't quite the way I wanted it to go, but it was a really good process in itself. That's the silver lining, that all of a sudden something that was seen as very much taboo or haram or forbidden was very much now in the limelight, and we were talking about it. And whether people agreed with it or disagreed with it, I was so relieved that Muslim communities were talking about this much more than ever before. You know, and at my age, that was a great boost really to my personal morale, because it allowed people to come out and speak up and be much more visible and vocal, and hopefully it's had a domino effect And there are, I have noticed in the last year as well, there's people standing up and wanting to be role models or activists or campaigners. And that for me is a great thing, especially those who are saying that they are part of the LGBT Muslim community in itself, because we've known for so many years, without reading the Quran, we've felt that Quran and Islam forbids homosexuality, but people who are much more sort of educated or much more informed, they can see beyond that as well, and they choose to interpret it in a better way, which makes it much more accessible, and I'm really, really pleased with that.
Okay, mad respect to you as an OG, a brown OG activist for LGBT rights. Jimmy's like laughing his face off. But I think that any kind of conversation to start is progress. I think that before people weren't really talking about it, and now we are. And even the fact that we can get ex-Muslims and Muslims, two camps that are often viewed as really, really contentious and really, really difficult to put together. We're sitting on a panel and we're all talking together, and I think that is progress. So last but not least, Jimmy, please do introduce yourself and what you do.
Hey, so Khakan, you are mad OG. You're like, you're one of the people at the front. I don't know how much older than me you are, but I certainly, it's good to see people in varying generations in this struggle, that we're represented all across the age spectrum. I think it's so important to have that. So when I was doing that, I was like, yeah, it was really good. I really loved it when I saw you and Saima step into, into the limelight around this kind of discourse. Although I think you both know that we disagree a lot in our positions on this. Nonetheless, it was like, oh my God, here's another Muslim voice with something to say. Even if I don't agree with what they've got to say, here's another person from Muslim heritage with something to say, because usually that's what's done in our community around homosexuality. Yeah. So the disagreement, I think, is fantastic, and I think how we get to truth, how we get to a position of knowledge, is through all of us bringing our opinions, and we sift it through together. Yeah, I take validity from where you come from, you acknowledge validity in what I'm saying, we reject what's not true, and then we get to a position. And we have to accept that sometimes those positions are unpalatable. Yeah, sometimes truth is unpalatable, but nonetheless, that should be our objective. So I think, just to give you a bit about myself, my name is Jimmy Bangash. I'm a spokesperson for the Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain, who I've been working with for a number of years now. I also, that focus tends to be around LGBT issues. It's kind of the area that I focus the most on. And that intersection, I guess, between being gay and also being ex-Muslim, and how often in our community, just being gay lands you as being ex-Muslim. So I think, whereas now in the West, we have much more
nuance,
visibility of people like Saima and Khakan. Certainly that wasn't the case 20 years ago when I was coming to terms with my sexuality. It was as simple as, well, if you're gay, you're not Muslim, get out. Yeah. So I think, perhaps that also informs my politics as well. So in addition to being a spokesperson for CEMB, I'm also the lead therapist and coach at Free Hearts, Free Minds, which is an organization that provides one-to-one coaching and mental health support in a therapeutic setting for people who are ex-Muslim in Muslim-majority countries. So working with people in Pakistan, working with women in Saudi Arabia, all across the globe in Muslim-majority countries, people are in some really difficult situations, who then have one-to-one, essentially secret therapy, because they're often at a point of suicide, and they can't go to any mental health practitioners in their own community because they have to keep this secret about not being Muslim. So we're really kind of trying to facilitate and cater so they've got a space to be heard in the same way that where we have mental health practitioners in the West. Those are the two main projects that I work on.
Thank you for that, Jimmy. Something that you said also is that when you were younger, that this sort of the option of being Muslim and gay didn't really exist, and now with progress we see that option exist, and I think it's a very important option to exist. You know, I have younger family members, family friends who, and students as well, because I'm an educator, who don't necessarily want to leave everything behind, but they want to transition into themselves. And sometimes it's more comfortable to make that transition to just, you know, I'm gay, but I'm still Muslim, as opposed to just being, I'm rejecting everything and I'm leaving everything behind, and you know, all of that stuff. So I want to open the discussion around, because we're going to be doing a little bit of bonding and solidarity later on between ex-Muslims and Muslims. I do want to start with the climate for LGBT rights as brown people, as Muslims, as ex-Muslims here in the UK, in Europe, in the West, and also how each of you have dealt with shunning and survival in your own way, if you have any anecdotes to share. So again, you can either keep it open or we can go in a clockwise manner, starting with Saima and then going around to Jimmy. Yeah? Okay, let's start with Saima.
Want to ask me the question again? Just so I've got...
It was a really long question. So through your work, what have you described the LGBTQIA climate in terms of, you know, us as brown people, us as Muslims and ex-Muslims here in the UK, in Europe, and in the West?
So if we think about the UK government and UK politics, so we've had a decade now of Conservative rule, and the Conservative policies tend to be very anti-LGBT. So I don't know if people have seen in the news, there's an anti-trans legislation that the Tories have secretly put through recently. And during the protests as well, we did a lot of lobbying to the Education Secretary to support Sarah and Andrew at the time, who really needed help from the state. And instead of championing LGBT education and elevating the teachers and the head teachers who were, you know, suffering so much, they just told them to stop teaching the lessons. And it was like a complete blackout. So if we're not getting the support from the state, you know, we're already on a back foot. So I do think it's very difficult. I think times are only going to get more and more difficult with the current government we've got. So I think unity is really important. And I think with everything that's happened, especially with George Floyd, if we look at systematic oppression of people of Black and people of colour and minority communities across the UK, it's only rising. And the rise of the far right and the rise of fascism and people like Trump are not helping. You know, our Prime Minister thinks it's okay to make racist comments and Islamophobic comments like calling women letterboxes, etc. You know, if we're hearing that from the state, what hope have we got in society? So I think it's difficult. Earlier on, you know, Khakan and Jimmy spoke about us as queer people of colour dealing with the intersections, or being at the intersection of like conflicting communities. And that really was key in the protest last year. The only reason I joined the debate was because I could see a very white narrative that didn't take into account any nuances in terms of, you know, the bad Muslims, you know, anti-LGBT, where my experience was completely different. And I absolutely understand it's a privileged position, but it's still a position and it's still a lived experience. So I think the only way we're going to make any difference is by sharing our lived experience, but also unity. You know I've made ignorant comments before. I've been on a massive journey in the last year, and you know I've probably said things that have offended people, for which I absolutely sincerely apologize. As activists, we're only human, and we're on a learning curve. So you know, so if there's anything I've said, you know, sincere apologies. But the only way we can move forward now is by building unity. For me, I'm very political. So for me, my lobbying is political and to the government. I didn't say earlier in the introduction, but actually my next stage now is building a network of queer Pakistanis and diaspora Pakistani communities. I've had a lot of contact from people all over the world, you know, people of faith, people without faith, and we've all got the same struggles. So actually it's now about using our privileges. And for me, for somebody who's so political, it's using my privileges and championing political reform in the country my parents came from, which is Pakistan. So that I'm going to pause on that and let somebody else come in, and then I'll come back.
I like that you can like sort of switch it off by yourself, because I find it very awkward to be like, okay, no, stop. So Khakan, can you, like, as we've said, like, mad respect as an OG, like, you've been an activist for a really, really long time for, you know, the brown LGBT movement, for Muslim LGBT people. And how would you describe the climate here in the UK, here in Europe? Describe the progress that you've seen through years as an activist. I'm not trying to make you feel old, by the way. I'm realizing that might be how it sounds. But yeah, like, describe the journey for us, because I think as someone who's, for me, for example, I didn't have much of an issue coming out as bisexual. It just wasn't something that was a big deal for me. Granted, I'd gone through all of my ex-Muslim struggles by that point, so I didn't have that sort of looming over me. But it was a very easy transition for me. There was no sort of internal strife about it. And I do feel like that was a privilege afforded to me, born in this time, you know, in this climate with that context. So please do share your experiences. I'll zip.
Okay. First of all, what is OG?
Original gangster.
Oh, okay. Thanks. showing off my age now. I think it's really difficult to see how things are moving on in some respects, but from my own personal perspective, it's, you know, I've always been very religious minded anyway. You know, I had a faith of some description. Even when I was studying religious education, I wanted to know more about Christianity, Hinduism, and all the other faiths that are on the spectrum. So there was that aspect of it, which I was very much interested anyway. And then obviously trying to come to terms with my own sexuality and sexual identity, that itself had its own baggage, because my father was a founder member of Birmingham Central Mosque, you know, and he founded that sort of with about 12 or 13 other people. So when I came through in the sort of like 1970s and 80s, we not only had taboo within the Western communities about Dallas and Dynasty and all these soap operas where it was very much frowned upon, where two men were kissing, we had to switch the channels. But also we also had Section 28, HIV and AIDS, and that was a struggle in itself, and nobody wanted to associate themselves with those particular aspects of education and social stigma. So for me, coming through in the mid 80s, again, I would see people who were part of the LGBT community, and there was nobody like me. There was no role models, no support services, no counselling. There was absolutely nothing. And even when I was picked upon, you know, I suppose today you'd call it homophobia or bullying or abuse, but at the time, I just used what was my only useful tool was to respond. And the only way to respond was trying to educate people. You know, if somebody called me something, I'd say to them, do you know what that means? Pansy, it's a flower. And, you know, try to explain and educate people that way. But little did I realize that, you know, I was part of the LGBT community, that not only was I appalled by it, but I was also admiring it at the same time, because I liked the sort of the flamboyancy, the sort of the gothic, the sort of all the different subcultures and genres that came through. You know, people were able to express themselves in whatever shape or form they wanted to. But obviously above all that, we had the dark cloud of, you know, Section 28 and HIV. So that in itself was a struggle in the community. And in my own home life, you know, I'm the youngest of 7, and my brothers are very much heterosexual, very much into their sports, into their girlfriends. And there was this expectation that I had to conform to how they are. Which was never going to happen for me anyway, you know, especially when my own mother used to encourage me to sing things like Mamma Mia and what we now see as gay anthems. Amazing. But again, for me, I think what we forget over the years is about how it impacts on our mental health, how we try to come to terms with it, you know, the anxiety issues, the confidence, the low self-esteem. For me personally, I became very much introverted and escaped into sort of make-believe world. So growing up, there was no role models, no peers that I could talk to. The ones that I could think that I could talk to were very much white, you know, and very much sort of effeminate, very theatrical. And then I started theatre studies, and that's when I opened up to what it means to be LGBT. I didn't experience anything whilst I was in college in Birmingham, but I did see a couple of tutors who were in themselves, they were very confident, and they didn't actually say that they were gay until much later, which was quite shocking, really. As I said, there was Section 28, which forbid any promotion of what they called homosexuality. And as a student in London, that's where my coming out experience happened. And then on the gay scene as well, again, I didn't feel I could fit in because I was a brown face in a white space. And even now, 30 years down the line, I hear the same narrative, that people feel uncomfortable, people who are of color or have faith, and they're trying to reconcile the two. They say that they feel uncomfortable in these spaces. And even when I was younger, and even now, I'm crying out for a space where people can come together, just like ex-Muslims and Muslims can come together, people who are drinkers and non-drinkers, people who have faith and no faith, that we can come together as an LGBT community. But what I've realized in the last few years, that the LGBT community per se has become very much divisive. That's obviously, like Saima was saying, it's geared by and steered by people like Donald Trump, Boris Johnson and others, who are gaining much more of a social media attention and a platform. But also within the South Asian community as well, there's divisions being created within the LGBT community. You know, you've got Sikh LGBT versus Hindu LGBT versus Muslim.
It's a never-ending competition.
And that to me is something that it's a crying shame, really, because everybody's clamoring for a voice, which I agree with. My group is called Finding a Voice, but I want people to listen, pay attention, and say that we are all united together, whether, like Jimmy is ex-Muslim and Saima and myself, we identify as Muslim. At the end of the day, we are all humans. And, you know, with movements like Black Lives Matter and all these anti-trans rhetoric that's coming through as well, I just sit down and every day I'm thinking, what on earth is happening to our communities? Our community is not just Birmingham or the Midlands or London. Our community is the whole globe. You know, wherever we go around the world, we should be able to sort of express ourselves however we want, and people should respect that. What I notice within the younger generation, though, is that some people are fighting fit and they are becoming much more visible. But there are younger ones, like Simon says, and Jimmy and previous speakers. There's an awful lot of people who are being shunned, either because of their sexuality or because of their faith. You know, and it's almost like they're saying that never the twain shall meet. But what we're trying to say is we can all be united and fight for improvement and strive for better qualities of life. You know, we had the Stonewall riots. I personally came through Section 28. And then when the protests occurred last year, I thought, oh my God, this is not the face of Islam. This is not the face of Birmingham. This is not the face of, you know, how people should be educated within the school setting, i.e. close down freedom of speech and censorship. What we need to do is educate people all around the world, within our communities, within our families, and say, however I identify, this is how God or Allah made me. Because when I was coming out, I was feeling so suicidal. I didn't know where to turn. I couldn't speak to my family, and I didn't have anyone in London. So I read the Quran and the Bible to try and make sense of it all. And this continual rhetoric to say Islam forbids homosexuality is completely wrong, because I've done my research. I've read it, and like Ludovic was saying, I look to it as guidance more than anything. I don't take the Quran as literal. I have to put it into context, historically, politically, and socially. And even now, when people come to me and saying they're feeling suicidal or depressed, or they can't manage to reconcile their sexual orientation and their faith, I ask them time and time again, have you actually read the Quran? And, you know, most of the time, these young people say that they don't. They only go by what they've heard, either their parents or through generations. And this is what is upsetting to me, because I say, go and read the Quran first, and then come back to me with questions. And what I also do from my perspective is I share stories of positive role models. I talk to them in particular about someone like Saima Razzaq here, because she's very visible in the media now. And then there's a couple of other Pakistani Muslim women, lesbians and bisexuals, who are coming through the public eye now. And these are the role models that I try to give a platform and lift and say, you can reconcile faith with your sexual orientation, and you can have a successful career, and you can have a happy life. And it's role models that we need more and more of, because as I said, I didn't have them when I was younger. And even now, if I'm part, what did you call me? Original gangster.
Yeah.
to be honest, I would like to see a lot more. I would like to see a lot more Muslims, LGBT coming forward from the older generation. You know, and Jimmy to be part of that community.
Thank you so much for that, Khakan. After all of this pandemic business is over, we definitely should go out and get a drink and create that space where there are drinkers and non-drinkers and Muslims and ex-Muslims and gay people and straight people and all kinds. But we're going to move on to Jimmy. I'm going to try and give you the appropriate amount of time. I had to make room for Khakan, obviously, but please do tell us about your experience going through, because I would say you're also an OG, but not as much as an OG as Khakan, but you're still an OG.
No,
like,
I think Khakan is. You can only have one OG, right? You
Yeah.
don't want to start gangster fights here because he'll win.
No, there's already a turf war here. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that you've been kind of spearheading the LGBT movement for ex-Muslims here in the UK. You've been the face of that through CEMB and through, I think, through other organizations as well. And I wanted to ask you, what was your experience going through that sort of similar dichotomy of Islam and being gay in the UK? As well as like your experience with shunning and persecution, because CEMB has been campaigning throughout the year against shunning. Shunning is abuse, shunning is torture. We've started some hashtags and also life after shunning, but we'll get to that in another segment. So please do describe those two things, I think, that I mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, so my story is quite out there quite a bit, and I really wanted to respond to some of the things that my co-panelists were saying. But how would you like me to? Would you want me to go with my story, or can I respond to that stuff?
Start by story, and then we'll have like a final.
Okay, so I'll give you a quick 30-second story because it's all over the internet. If anyone, there's a number of podcasts. There's even on CMB's website, lots of podcasts that I've been on that people can access. But essentially, I was born in London in a British Pakistani family. My family all speak Pashto. I think that means us Pakhtun. I don't really know what that means, but I can pronounce it properly. Yeah, so and within our community, I think what I really struggled with from a very early age was just the ardent misogyny and homophobia. Like it became abundantly clear as a child, the youngest child of 7, like Khakan. I didn't know we had that in common. So it became abundantly clear that my sisters weren't able to do things that I could do. And the way that my sisters' bodies were policed wasn't the way that my body was policed in terms of the way that they had to dress, this obsessiveness around women's virginity in our community that didn't extend to male virginity somehow, all of these different facets. But then coming into an age where I became more aware of my sexuality, I was like, oh my God, this is really going to get difficult now, because I'm probably a decade or two after Khakan. So in the 90s, there was like, just ardent homophobia across British society anyway. But British society wasn't necessarily talking about executing you for being gay in the way that Islamic society was. So it was like this wider homophobia, but then this very concentrated homophobia within our community as well. And as I said, we didn't really have, well, Imam, I think they did exist, like a web page somewhere, like when we had the internet, but they weren't really around in the same way that Imam, Hidayah, Matt and Naz Foundation, Seeds and all of these other organizations, they didn't really exist at that time. And I think it's quite interesting what Khakan said about, he tells people to go and read the Quran and then come back to him. Well, I think sometimes people read the Quran and then they're like, crikey, this is what I'm expected to believe in. Like, they might get to verse 434, which is all about the stages you go through before you can hit your wife, or they might get to the story of Lut, and then people tell them, well, actually, the interpretation of this is around sodomites, and that's why God destroyed the whole of Prophet Lot's and his people without him. Or they might read the Hadith, which are very clear and explicit around how gay people should be executed, whether you're the person who's active or passive. So I think whereas some people might read the Quran and then go back to Khakan with some different understanding, I think for a lot of us who read the Quran or who go and read the Hadith or then go and look at theological discourse, so even outside of that, the jurisprudence, the scholastic conversations around homosexuality, they're not aligned to the way that, the mainstream ones are not aligned to the way that Khakan and Saima think around homosexuality in Islam. Actually, the dominant narrative around Islam and homophobia is that the Sharia compliant methodology to deal with it is via execution. And then when you have that execution, the scholastic discourse around what is the best way to kill your gay? Like, how can you please God the best by killing your gay? Is it like hanging him, like in Iran? Is it like putting him in a circle and having the community stoning him to death, as we see in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan? Is it by throwing him off the rooftop, as we saw under ISIS and other extremist organizations? These things don't come from nowhere. There's actual theological and scholastic discussion about it. And I think when I saw all of this kind of stuff, initially, and both of you, my co-panelists, have touched on about the mental health components of this, is, there was these moments of one, suicidal ideation, like, actually, should I just end it all now? But I'm still Muslim, so if I kill myself, I'm definitely going to hell, because that's what Islam says about, suicide, right? So I can't kill myself, but I can't ever express this sexuality, because then I'm definitely going to hell, because it's such a major sin. There was so much wrapped up in that, but where it landed was definitely this acceptance that gay people should be dead. So I'm walking around my life thinking, okay, God has said gay people should be dead. Every verifiable scholar, every masjid that I ask, every imam that I talk to, and even every family member in our community is expelling the same rhetoric of death, 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 destruction, death, death. How I landed was in this place of actually gay people should be killed for a very long time, and then turned to increase religiosity in the hopes that I could pray away that gay. It would just be gone. God would, when I used to make wadu, when I used to, for those who don't know what that is, when we used to wash ourselves before prayer, I'd really wish that God would wash away the gayness from me. And you can imagine like what sort of mental health and self-worth issues that would cause in an individual. And I don't think it's a coincidence that now I work as a psychotherapist for people, in the same arena, right? So that's kind of where I was. And then my family actually found out I was gay. I was then disowned. I went through all of that turmoil that shunning causes, and this complete sense of isolation, this community that had told me everything that I needed to think, what foot I had to use to step into the bathroom when I step in, how to drink water, like the 3 sips of water, how I should deal with my facial hair. This community that had prescribed every aspect of my life then kicked me out and said, actually, you're gay, get the hell out of here, we want nothing to do with you. And my situation was quite bad. It turned into family members at some point, saying that they were going to get a hitman to kill me. So it got really, really quite ugly. But what essentially saved me was secular Western society. And I think it's such an important thing to acknowledge that actually that when there are people of Muslim heritage who end up in my position and we end up going to the police, it is essentially Western secular democracy that saves us from that diaspora community that is trying to persecute us. And it's an uncomfortable truth. Like, it's a really uncomfortable truth that actually the people who come to our aid are the white people from the Western democracy that we live in. It is the laws in the Western democracy that keeps us alive. Because if I was in Pakistan, it would be a corpse. It wouldn't be myself here talking to you. Yeah. And I think just to leave that story and touch on some of the points that my co-panelists have said, is I think there's some really uncomfortable truths, and we have to acknowledge them. So Pew Research just did a paper that was their 2019 study on global views of homosexuality. Yeah, and what they found, as they found every single year, is that actually people who are religious are more homophobic. There's just no getting around that. Generally, that's a huge truth that comes out. People who are not religious are generally more accepting of homosexuality. For those people who are religious, the people who say that their religion plays a significant, important part in their life are more homophobic than the people who are religious who say that the religion doesn't play a significant part of their life. Yeah, so we see that with increased religiosity, there's increased homophobia. And then all religions are not created equal. Like, in terms of their homophobia, all religions are not equally homophobic. And again, this is a deeply uncomfortable truth. So we know that actually in the UK, as overall, that same study told us that only 11% of people in the UK said that homosexuality shouldn't be accepted. But when we break that down to Muslim people's attitudes, what we see is that 52% of British Muslims say that homosexuality should be criminalized. 47% of them say that they shouldn't be teachers.
So, Jimmy, you'll actually have a little bit more time to talk about that in the next panel that you're also on.
Sure.
So I didn't want to let you go on for too long to save some content for there. I will allow Saima and Khakan to give some final statements before we have another intermission. So Saima, please go for it.
So I think when it comes to data and research, sometimes it also depends on who you're asking. You could ask 100 people this. So I think we can't hold on to data. I'm a marketing comms person. So you can use data to tell any story. But the points you make are valid. It's the reason why I'm now going to start focusing more on campaigning in Pakistan, because it's really important for me to use my privileges to try and instigate changes there, because that will naturally have a domino effect on diaspora communities. So I think that's important, but I think we just have to be really careful not to generalize everyone, because like I say, my experience has been very different. And even in Birmingham, what I've noticed is last year where some people did, and actually I'm talking about elderly Pakistani men and women getting in touch and saying they would help me loads, and supported me through very difficult times. But this year, what I found is now where the school protest stuff has died down a bit, and I have a business, so I'm focused more on my actual work, my life. And there's a lot of people now that are getting in touch that might have stayed quiet last year because it's still a taboo subject, and have reached out to say, actually, no, we saw you last year, and we're here to support you, and they're happy to support in the business. So I think we can change hearts and minds. It involves difficult conversations. It involves strong personalities. I've got a really thick skin. I really don't give a shit about anything anymore. So it's just not going to offend me. So they can say what they want, but people, with those privileges really need to shout louder. And, like Khakan says, more and more people are coming to the fold. So if you see in the British press, last week we had an article in the Times, Sunday Times. It was a young barrister called Mohsin who spoke about his experiences. His experience was very similar to mine. So it's about being as loud as we can and just bringing a lot of people along with us, and not fighting, no infighting, because that's division just only makes our struggle harder. So we just have to unite on all the commonality and just sometimes put differences aside. Because the truth remains, as LGBT people, we are persecuted across the globe. And, is that going to change in our lifetime? Probably not. But if we start shouting louder, then hopefully the next generations will have a bigger head start than we had.
Khakan, your final statement before we go into the intermission. You're muted.
I think using Jimmy's analogy about people who are very religious are the most homophobic, then I guess I must be homophobic, because in my mind, I am quite religious. I'm very religious minded anyway, so, and I also think that his own personal experiences, it shouldn't tar the rest of the Muslim community as well. I mean, although I take on board what he's saying, and I do appreciate it as well a lot, but, his experience maybe made him somewhat bitter towards the Muslim community. I'm not too sure. But even for my own coming out experience, as I said, thinking about religion or thinking about suicide, thinking about, what does Islam say? It made me come through as a stronger person. But I also was very, very fortunate in that when I did come out, I had the support of my mom eventually and my father later on. But I also found my partner as well, my lifetime partner, who has been a rock beside me as well. And he supported me through this in the last few years, and especially since the protests flared up last year and changed the dynamics and changed the narrative. But what I'm really glad of is that, I keep saying time and time again, the silver lining that I take is that we are having conversations, you know, and whether we agree or disagree, we need to show that respect and understanding. We also have to remember, and Simon will agree on this, is about smashing the patriarchy.
Yes, absolutely. I think Khakan's frozen. So Jimmy, I know you have points to make, and we're actually skipping the intermission, and we're sorry, Saima, you will be back on the next panel. So we're going to trade you out for Ludovic. Sorry, just doing a little bit of welcome back, Ludovic-Mohamed Zahed. So this is a perfect segue because I know that Jimmy wants to respond to some of the things that have already been said. And I'm going to let him do that, and then we'll have a circular discussion. Whoever wants to speak, just raise your hand and we'll take it from there. So yeah, Jimmy.
So is this a new panel?
This is a new panel. So this is all about...
What is this panel about?
Sorry. This is about political and ideological differences between Muslims and ex-Muslims in terms of the LGBT. Sorry, I just completely forgot that we moved on because we'd already moved into the conversation. But it's all about political and ideological differences between LGBT rights, between Muslims and ex-Muslims. And I think that Ludovic-Mohamed may have some context associated to that. Obviously, Khakan has experience, and Jimmy also has experience and context. So, yeah. So, Jimmy, feel free to respond to the last few minutes of the last panel, and then we'll go around.
Perfect. And I think it would be really great if we get Saima back on this panel as well.
Sure.
Just for more people. So I just want to respond to a couple of things. There's always this. It's a little bit annoying, not hugely annoying, but I'm just going to name what it is. So there's always this annoying tendency to personalize the rhetoric. Yeah. So you had a rubbish experience with your family, therefore you are anti-Muslim, or therefore this has colored your perception of Islamic communities. And actually what I'd suggest is, if I was using anecdotal stories to inform my perspective, that would definitely be accurate, which is why I step away from my own personal experience and I say, where we look at statisticians, like industry-leading organizations like Pew Research, which is the Oxford or Cambridge level type of universities, that's where Pew Research is seen, yeah? They're really well renowned for the work that they do. We have to step away from the Jimmy story. We have to step away from the Khakan story, from the Saima story, in order to see what the real picture presents itself. So when I say, actually what the data shows us is that if you are religious, you're more likely to be homophobic. That doesn't mean, because listen to the words that I'm saying, that doesn't mean all religious people are homophobic. That's literally not what I said. When I say 52% of British Muslims say that homosexuality should be criminalized, that doesn't say all British Muslims think that homosexuality should be criminalized. We know that 18%, which is a, you know, for someone, for Khakan and for me, 18% of British Muslims saying that actually homosexuality shouldn't be criminalized is quite a big deal, because if you went back 10 years ago, I don't think you'd have double digits. And if you went back 20 years ago, you certainly wouldn't have double digits. So yes, we have to acknowledge the progress, but we also have to acknowledge the problem. And it's too easy to say that person over there is saying this because of their personal experience. No, he's using data, and the data is what informs my opinions. And I just want to say one last thing on the, before I hand over so that someone else can talk. So there was this idea that those Birmingham protests in the UK, you know, that Saima had positioned, which was it was becoming quite a white narrative, yeah? Or it was becoming white people versus the Muslims. And I'd suggest that you only see it that way if you have embedded yourself in identity politics rhetoric. Because really, when you looked at the situation in Birmingham, what you saw was homophobia and people who weren't homophobic. But if you colored those people in different shades, well then yeah, the people who were homophobic turned out to be brown, and the people who weren't homophobic were more likely to be white. But that's because the data completely supports that narrative. Across the UK, only 11% of people say that homosexuality shouldn't be accepted. So most of the majority of the UK society thinks it's okay to be gay. But when you break it down into the Muslim community, there is a horrendously disproportionate rate of homophobia in that community. And it's 52% who said that it should be not accepted, but actually criminalized. It should be a criminal activity. Think about how extreme that viewpoint is, yeah? And then we all saw the map that Lilith was standing in front of. It was blue, 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 red, right in one point. And when you look at the point that it was red, it's all of the Muslim majority countries. Indonesia, 80% say that actually it shouldn't be acceptable to be gay. Lebanon, 85%. Tunisia, 72%. And Tunisia is quite progressive when it comes to the Middle East. So we're seeing these countries go over and over and over again in Pew Research. Every single time they do the study, it's Muslim majority countries that show the worst. We have to be honest that actually throughout the UK society, throughout the globe, the communities that are the most homophobic are Muslim majority communities. And pretending that it has nothing to do with Islam isn't helpful. It's actually hindering our progress.
If I can just a brief point on that. I'm trying to stay as impartial as possible, but I am an ex-Muslim, and I just want to say that I don't think that Jimmy is trying to say that there aren't any other factors that go into this as well. Islam is just a factor, and unfortunately it's an uncomfortable factor that is worth talking about, and it's only until we get more nuanced interpretations of Islam that are more accepting, like the kinds that Khakan and Ludovic-Mohamed follow, that we can progress. And until we have these uncomfortable discussions, I think it's really, really difficult.
Or we could get rid of Islam. That is another option.
Or that, but I don't feel like that's realistic, at least not in my lifetime, certainly not, and I'm pretty young. But anyway, I'm going to pass it over to whoever wants to address Jimmy's points. Okay, so Ludovic-Mohamed, I think that we need to reintroduce you. So please do, comment.
Okay, so no, that's very interesting. As I said before, I really said very clearly that Islam is part of the problem, but it's not the only source of the problem. So as you said, Faye, and as Jimmy pointed out, we have to face that problem. We have to face it in an efficient way. Otherwise, we're going to have the same issues, as you said, Faye, in our lifetimes, in 20 years, in 30 years, on one layer on top of another, with racism, with globalization, capitalization, pinkwashing, and we're going to be completely lost, and we're going to leave to the next generation an even more complicated situation than the one we have today. So when you read at statistics, you always have to keep in mind, in sociology, generally speaking, that there's like determining factors that are obvious. And those factors, as I said before, a lower analysis level, determining factors, more important sometimes, but hidden. So, for example, to take some distance with that, because statistics are very important, they're telling us so many things. So somebody as Saima said before that you can make statistics say everything and anything, more or less, but at least you have to make them talk. It's not enough, just statistics. So, for example, you have statistics such as those in regards to criminality. Criminality, 80% of crimes in France are committed by Black, colored, Arab people. So some people are saying now in France, I'm sure in the UK and somewhere else, you have the same kind of commentators, experts of everything and nothing at the same time, telling us that, you see, we've told you it's because they're coming from Middle East and Africa. Of course, that's racist, and we've seen the problems that the American society is facing now after the killing of George Floyd and many others, unfortunately. We had the same killing of innocent or criminals, but killed just because they were arrested and they have been shot in the street and so on in France. I'm just saying that you have to make those statistics talk. You have to have a point of view about those statistics. Otherwise, you just get even more lost. And you also have statistics telling you that there's more than 50% of Muslim Americans pro-gay marriage in the USA. So what do we do with that? How is it possible that those guys are pro, and in Saudi Arabia and Algeria, and they want to kill all gays and queers and so on? How do you reconcile those two kinds of statistics. We're talking about Muslims. That's very interesting, because we're starting to see something that we can, you know, pull and try to understand what's going on behind those facades of Islam. Islam doesn't exist. Sociologically, there's no Islam. Islam doesn't speak. So we speak about Islam is this, Islam is responsible of that. No, Muslims. And the sociology of Muslims in the USA is not at all the same that the sociology, for example, of Muslims in France. In France, they're mainly coming from North Africa, from poor backgrounds, economical backgrounds, with lower education. It's not the same in the USA. So here we start to see that there's some hidden factors, education, economical empowerment, that might help us. I'm not saying it's the solution. I'm saying it's too complex to put it only on one factor. So yeah, Islam is part of the problem, because we are part of the problem. We are building Islam. Somebody said before, Lilith said, yeah, that prophet used to take drugs and whatever he said. That's very, very interesting, because drugs and dance and sex and all of that is part of spirituality, even within Islam for centuries. And all of a sudden, 20th century, as I said before, it became such a huge problem. And Muslims were seen as bisexual by nature and perverts and so on by French intellectuals, condemning them, telling them, oh, you are so different from us, because it was so Victorian and conservative here in Europe. They were killing and burning alive homosexuals. Same thing happened, but at different times with a mirror perspective. So now the state homophobia is more or less on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea. So clearly, you could not explain that just by Islam. And Islam as a culture, as a religion, as a tradition, as a law, what kind of Islam, what branch of Islam. So once we start deconstructing that problem, we start to see the hidden factors. So yes, of course, Islam is part of the problem, because Islam is us. So when some people telling us you could not be queer Muslim, it might hurt, and we had experienced violence and so on, and that's terrible, of course. But one of the best arguments to oppose to those people is to tell them that we are also part of Islam. We're also, even if we don't believe in God, we're also part of that culture. So this is also our culture. And a very interesting point, Jimmy, you said about the Western white democracies and so on. Yes, of course, but that's also part of the problem. When you have, so part of the solution in terms of human rights defense and grassroots organizations free to fight for LGBT plus rights and so on. But that's also part of the problem, because you have at the same time in those countries, in our countries, I'm French, societies going to Africa and taking half of the country's incomes for decades with the franc CFA, and going to Indonesia, to Saudi Arabia, and to Tunisia. They were selling in 2011, the French government was about to sell arms, weapons, to fight back the revolution into the Tunisian government. So at some point, our democracies, of course, they are sustaining human rights. And of course, we have more freedom of speech and sexual freedom here in terms of identity, choice, and whatever. But at the same time, we also have some dynamics in our countries supporting those fascistic governments on the other side of the sea, because there's some economical and political advantages in that. How many wars in Middle East for oil and gas? How could we take that out of the equation? So I'm just saying that, as I said before, it's an intersectional problematic. We could not explain all of that just by one factor or the other. We have to have a systemic understanding, systemic understanding of that problematic in order to have the right solutions and to find, I've heard that term that I'm almost never using, truth. To find out some kind of truth, a representation of the truth, at least, like Plato would put it, we have to have a systemic understanding of the problem. And when we go back to the texts, we have to do the same thing. Scholars have been, a majority of scholars have been saying that homosexuality is haram for 100 or 150 years only, We published a book last year with the University of Amsterdam about Islam, homosexuality, trans identity, that I can send with pleasure by email, about the fact that we have to look at all the sources in the Quran, in the Hadith, in a systematic way, not taking only that Hadith coming from Abu Huraira, who was a closed up, effeminate man before, and then he started to be very patriarchal, very homophobic and misogynistic. There's no coincidence there also. So if we have very homophobic scholars using Islam to justify their point of view, we had that also in the past. To be very careful about that, not to be fooled.
Okay, so if I can make a brief comment, pass it to Khakan because I feel like he's been quiet for quite a while, and then get a final statement from Jimmy. I do want to say that it is an interesting point to say that at some point in the golden age of Islam that this kind of homosexual narrative existed, and it would be interesting to see how they brought that back in, because, you know, as someone who used to be a Salafist, as someone who used to follow a very Islamist narrative, and how toxic that can be towards LGBT, you know, not just toxic, but deadly it can be to LGBT people. You know, for me, that kind of thinking is very interesting, that at some point in the golden age, people were allowed to flourish with their sexuality and other kinds of spiritual things. But anyway, that's enough of me. Khakan, please do feel free to share what you think.
I really think what we need to look at is what it means to be Muslim, first and foremost, when we're talking about, you know, Jimmy was saying that we need to abolish or ban Islam completely. I have to consider, you know, how many people around the world. Sorry, what was it that Jimmy said then? It was some. Anyway, get rid of Islam. Get rid of Islam.
Just that it's an option. We're exploring options.
Yeah, well, it's not an option that I'm going to take, unfortunately. But I really think, you know, when we look at Islam per se, we need to look at what it means to be Muslim first and foremost, before we look at sexual orientation and identity, and how people interpret that particular level of being Muslim, you know, because I know people who are Muslim, who claim to be Muslim, and they smoke, drink, fornicate a lot, you know, and all that type of thing, but they still identify as Muslim. But then there's others who, you know, they don't observe the 5 pillars of Islam, but they still identify as Muslim. And first of all, you need to look at how does that make you as an authentic person, how you interpret it and how you navigate yourself through life anyway, through your family, through communities, through work and educational places. So in first and foremost, as I said, look at Muslim, what it means. Then we need to look at who is at the top of this chain of hierarchy. We need to look at who is in power, who is propagating this misinformation about Islam and homosexuality. You know, because Ludovic was saying it's about 150 years ago that people turned against homosexuals, but from my research, it was before that even. It was 500 years ago when a caliph in an Islamic state, he was very much heterosexual, very machismo, and he just had some propaganda against the homosexuals because he thought it was, he couldn't believe that 2 men could have sex together. And then that information propagated itself throughout the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Islamic states. And then what I say time and time again to people is that you need to figure out, where does this information come from first and foremost? A lot of people who say LGBT is haram, I ask them, like I said earlier, I ask them have they read the Quran. They say no, my mom told me, or my father or whatever told me. And then you look at their backgrounds and you look at their history, and we look at the agricultural aspects of people coming in from Pakistan and India and other parts of the world, where agriculture, not schooling or education is the priority, but agriculture. So people are learning through hearsay and by rote that it's wrong. You know, they're not looking at the individual and what they can offer communities, how we contribute to society. So I think when we're looking at LGBT Muslims, we need to raise the platform and the narratives and share the positive stories that we're experiencing. As I said time and time again, you know, we have LGBT Muslims who are coming through now, and I applaud them and I admire them, and especially those who reconcile with their faith and their identity. Because it's important that we listen to what people have to offer, rather than time and time again hear the negative narratives that, you know, they're being thrown off the hilltops and the rooftops, and they're being, you know, ostracized and isolated. We need to hear more, and it's unfortunate that the media as well has a lot to play in this game as well. You know, Jimmy has referred to the data of 52% Muslims are against LGBT, but I've also read that data as well, and I'm thinking, Who is the source of that information? Which part of the UK did they go and do the questioning? And from my experience as well, you know, I think of, well, the other side is 48%. They're very accepting of LGBT Muslims. And I have another
18%, just so we get the data clear. It's only 18% in that same survey.
Okay,
so just because you have 52, it doesn't mean 48 is okay. 18% were okay, then the others.
All right.
As I said, you need to look at the source of where that information comes from. Who are the participants of that interview?
I'm gonna step in. So I'm gonna give the final statement to Jimmy. You got 2 minutes because I need to move on to the next topic.
Okay, so I just want to say, like, I'm going to be really quick. So Ludwig, you know, like, I appreciate what you're saying. I really love the fact that you're vaping on screen. That's amazing. So I think what there's a risk of this broadening out of our analysis so that it reaches levels of obfuscation, really. Like, it becomes so murky, our analysis of the situation, that it renders our action devoid of any direction. When you finish talking, by the time you'd finished, I didn't know whether we were looking at socioeconomics, poverty, religion, gender, class. You know what I mean? Like, there was just so many different components that you're bringing into it. But actually, the truth of the matter is, when we sit down in our communities, the reason that people want to kill gay people is because of Islam. It's not because of socioeconomics. It's not even because of patriarchy, this concept that's out there. It's not about our class. It's not about our race. It's actually, you're gay. Islam says gays should be dead. We want to kill you because it's Sharia compliant and the right thing to do. And I think we need to be focusing on that because it's the main reason for homophobia in our community. It's what all of those red countries have in common when we looked at the map behind Lilith. And this constant tracing back of our issues back to white people, like, how can we make sure that white people are accountable for the homophobia in our community is just tired and absurd. Increasingly, there are more and more people of color who are saying, you know what? We're not slaves to white people ideology anymore. And we can see this difference because if we look at India and Pakistan, and we look at the progress that India, which was also colonized, which Pakistan fractured off from, has managed to make traction and progress around LGBT rights in the same way that Pakistan has absolutely not been able to make that traction because, surprise, surprise, Islam. You know, we can see the difference. We need to be really focused on what the problem is here. And if what you're saying to me, like what Faye was saying, was we need some Care Bear, leprechaun, colorful rainbow version of Islam, great. But at least we have to start off with the clarity, which is Islam is the issue. The mainstream interpretation of Islam is the issue for homophobia in our community. And then my last point, because I think we should give Ludwig a moment to jump back in. My last point is this, is stop it. Stop it, guys. Everybody's somehow a statistician all of a sudden and poking holes in statistical data that is gathered by industry-leading organizations. The British one was done by a leading British statistician organization. The Pew Research is one of the leads as well. You cannot use data to say anything you want it to, because you couldn't take that same data and say, based on this poll, Muslims love gays.
All right. Very last point by Ludwig for a minute, and then we're gonna move it on to the next topic. You got a minute, short. Ludwig.
Yeah. There's 2 sentences, 2 examples. So one example is that when we founded the Inclusive Mosque, people from Zaytuna, Tunis, and Al-Azhar, imams in Egypt, 1,000-years-old universities and theological institutes and so on, condemned us, told us, you're not Muslims and blah, blah, blah. And then 10 years later, when they saw that we were more and more visible as inclusive progressive Muslim movement internationally, they started having debates in Arabic and English on TV programs and so on, and starting to look like not that bad and bit cool, because they were like they were losing the fight. Anyway, so I think that to put it very short, we need people like Jimmy kicking them in the ass, and we need people like us talking about Hadith and Quran, and that's it. Inshallah, it's gonna work. They have no choice.
I think we can agree on this multifaceted approach. I think we can.
There's more than one way to make change. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you, the 3 of you, for being on screen. We are going to move on. We're going to bring back Nemat. We're going to bring back Lilith. And we are going to bring back Saima to talk about sorry, where am I? So we're talking about life after shunning, so survival and activism. So thank you for jumping back in, guys. Thank you. I didn't need to do that. Wonderful. So we've all been introduced to you guys, and take it away. Feel free to discuss, add whatever thoughts you want to the last discussion if you feel like you need to say something. I feel like Saima's bursting. But Lilith raised her hand, so let's do Lilith first and we'll go up and around. There's a mirror going on. But yeah, go ahead.
It was quite an interesting topic, the last one. I was listening to all of the panelists and I really loved it. I would like to add just a very small point to the discussion that we had earlier, is that I think it's not important if Islam is going to stay there or if Islam is not going to stay there. The important thing is if religion will have the power to dictate us how we can live our lives, that does matter. You are all allowed to say you're Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Christians, whatever you want. You want a God in your life, you can have one. It doesn't matter. But the moment you say, because my God says this and this, and that's why you cannot do that and that, that's where the problem begins. And it could be a God, it could be a dictator, it could be anyone who can dictate that, and it could be any agency which is having the power to dictate the lives of the people. It could be anything. It's not just that. And Jimmy pointed out that most of the countries, they have this red. He pointed out like 3 times. I noted that. Like most of the red countries, they are Muslim countries. Of course, they are Muslim countries. And the reason behind that is that in most of these countries, there are no democratic powers. They are not democracies in the sense of democracy, the way democracy should be. They are mostly countries where you have either puppet governments dictated by the elite, or you have people who are literally dictators and say like loudly and very pompously, like Brunei. We all know about this small kingdom of Brunei last year. They were like, let's start hanging and cutting off heads of gay people. Like, how? And they are not even that much. It's not even a big population, but it was all over the media. It was everywhere. And that if we look into the life of the Sultan or the Shah, whatever he is, if there is an Islam, he doesn't even depict that. He has no Islam in his life. like you are, sorry, this is live, but I'm a very blunt person. You are washing your ass with gold-plated showers.
Yes, get him.
Exactly. It's the most absurd thing ever happening. But my only message is that we cannot get rid of religions. We don't even want to get rid of religions. People have a right to have a religion, but at the same time, people have a right to be the way they are and express themselves the way they are, because it's very important that we should not take away their identities. If you want to say you're Muslim, you're gay, you're lesbian, you're trans, well and good. But you cannot say, oh, you cannot be an ex-Muslim. You cannot be an apostate. You cannot discuss and criticize my religious point of view. I have all the rights to criticize your religious point of views, but your religious point of views. The problem is views and not you. That's it. Thank you.
Saima, let's have your take.
Just going on the Lilith. Personal interpretation, human interpretation.
You're coming in a little unclear.
How's that now?
That's better. Thank you.
Okay, I'll sit forward. So yeah, like Lilith was saying, it's not the religion, it's the person. And you know, if we look at the map there on Lilith's screen and the red areas, you know, who controls them? You know, culturally, who controls them? Who sanctions democracy? For me personally, when I look at Pakistan, you know, one of the failures of it as a country is the fact that it decided to take the leadership our faith as opposed to a constitution, or and that's been the failure of democracy in Pakistan. And that, for me personally, as a diaspora member of the community, I think it's really important to recognize that. But it's my opinion, but I don't think it's the religion. It's the people behind the religion. People also talk about the story of Lot. I see the story of Lot as an act of rape. So again, I'm sure in this room, in this conversation, we probably all have differences of opinion, but we have to recognize those differences of opinion, because that's the only way we're going to change hearts and minds. Again, look at Britain. The thing is, what everything comes down to in this world is money. Money talks. So the only reason Brunei conformed was the rest of the world said, fine, we're not going to do business with you. There were people protesting outside hotels, people shouting, and it all worked. It was all activism that made that happen. So we have to just look at what are the controlling situations, and in my opinion, capitalism, money, the power of the man, the power of the patriarchy. It kind of murkies the water for everything else. Culture isn't religion. My culture isn't my faith. Unfortunately, there's so many nuances within the South Asian culture that sometimes it becomes difficult to define what is culture and what is faith. But I think as activists, that's something that we should, really push on a bit more and highlight. And I'm sorry, if a man grows a beard suddenly later in life, doesn't suddenly mean he's like the holiest person in the world, because he's oiling a beard. That doesn't make a person.
Unfortunately, some people do think that way, though.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I'll stop if you want to move on.
Sure. I just wanted to give Nemat an opportunity to comment on the last discussion before we move on to the topic.
Yeah, I think it's definitely, I liked where we left off the last discussion about we both need both reformist Muslims and ex-Muslims to continue their narratives in order to chip away at the power of the ruling elite. And I think that there's several things I wanted to bring up. My fictional hero is, in The Carpet Weaver, is a gay ex-Muslim Maoist man who grew up in Afghanistan, lived in an internment camp in Pakistan, and then entered the United States. And I don't filter. I don't try to sugarcoat and write for the Islamic gaze or the white gaze or anybody's gaze for that matter. And I really show, really what it's like for somebody with those kind of, overarching multiple identities to face religious, political, and sexual persecution. And it's not just persecution he faces by the Islamic order, but even when the communists come into power in Afghanistan, when they're trying to impose, as I mentioned in my earlier segment, a state atheism, and on everybody, and taking everybody. So that becomes a religion, So I think what we should really try to do is help create the space for everybody to have freedom of belief in Muslim majority countries. And I think we need to be vocal and be very loud. And what's very troubling for me, I know we see this in the women's rights movement, where we have Western liberals take a cultural relatives perspective and say, oh, but those brown women and black women in Africa and Asia, it's not up to us to discuss. It's we should be particular to culture. And the same thing we experience with LGBT. I myself have received so much backlash from American white liberals who called me Islamophobic. And I said, there's a difference between Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry. And it's like, listen, I'm a victim of this. I grew up in the United States, and you're also shunning me the same way that people within my faith group are doing it. So what makes you different? And we saw this last year when the Trump administration, of course, we know that they did this for political purposes. And, when the Trump's ambassador to Germany rolled out a plan to decriminalize homosexuality around the world, across the Muslim world, in Russia, China, and we know this was just a PR stunt. But regardless, I think that the liberals here, they went and said, oh, this is a racist campaign and we should not be talking about LGBT rights and this. And, and it's like basically like erasing all the people in LGBT people in Muslim world, hundreds of millions of people, just denying them living in an open air prison, denying them their right to, you're basically saying they have no rights because it's racist for anybody here, for the Trump administration or anybody for that matter in the West to talk about them. And also you're silencing me. And so those are the kind of problems I've been facing. It's not just a one battle where we're facing the puritanical Muslim elite in Muslim countries that we are trying to make change in. It's also here. It's everywhere. We're getting attacked from each side. So I think we need to have a constructive approach of what is the best way forward to really help people. And then another thing is that, when I was published in India last year, the Indian media really sensationalized this because, the Modi government is trying to really show the world that it's LGBT friendly. So it's really trying to paint a picture. And obviously we know domestically with the citizenship bill, which prevents Muslims from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan to get citizenship in India, they're not allowed. So they really, really used me as for their own publicity, domestic and foreign policy, as oh, here's the gay ex-Muslim and everything like that, and published about how here's the first publicly known gay person from Afghanistan who's published this novel, first LGBTQ book published out of Central Asia. And I was receiving backlash, well, very small backlash, by people within the LGBT community saying that I was erasing queer narratives for people who have written journals in their heart, and they basically journals in their heart, people who are LGBTQ in Afghanistan that never got their stories out. So you're getting attacked from all sides within our community, outside of our community. So I want to see if we can bring Lilith and Saima and see what they think about what's the best way for us to take this conversation forward.
I do think that that's a perfect segue because we're going to be talking about shunning and activism, and that is a struggle that we've seen with activism, is that people sort of opportunistically picking and choosing our narratives for their own sort of gain and their own intentions. So it'd be interesting to look at the activism side, but also cover any kind of shunning, whether it be due to the activism or whether it be because of your LGBT identity within your families, within your communities. I think it would be a very interesting discussion to have. I think we'll go anti-clockwise again. Never mind. Lilith, go for it. I'm sorry. Go for it. Please do share your thoughts.
So I will now come to the topic that we have for this panel, like shunning and activism and all of that. And how does it all connect with being LGBTI and Muslim or ex-Muslim, both of that, for that matter. So I think most of us from the South Asian diaspora, somehow or other. So I'm the first generation person, Nemat as well, and I'm not sure about Saima, maybe the second generation or the first generation. Second, right? So we have seen how politicized Islam in our lives is in those countries. It plays a role in each and everything that we do in the society. So as long as I was in Pakistan, I couldn't do openly any kind of activism regarding may it be trans rights, may it be LGB rights, and LGB rights are still not a topic in the country. But sorry, just get between the languages. I'm so sorry. So I used to have a community, safe space, and talk about our experiences back then. And I think we need that. Once you start opening up about your identities, when you start opening up about your self-realization, may it be anything, you need to have those safe spaces where you can talk about it. May it be LGBTI Muslims, may it be LGBTI ex-Muslims, it doesn't matter. We all need those spaces. And then thankfully I had that back in Pakistan. I was in connection with some of the elite of LGBTI people back then. Not everyone has those resources. These resources are very rare. And I'm happy that we have people like Ludovic. I'm happy we have people like Saima. Like, you first realize your sexuality, and maybe after that you will realize about your Islam, or maybe not about your Islam. So it goes in that direction. So I started my activism in Germany in 2015. The moment I started my activism, I lost all the contacts in Pakistan. I got death threats. I got hate, and so much hate. It was like, you're a sinner, you will burn in hell, and how dare you come out with your gender identity and your sexuality in open. You can do all you want, but it should be hidden and away from the society. And I was like, no, I'm not going to live behind the curtains. I'm not going to go back into the closet. I have lived a long time in the closet. And it was, how should I say, you are living in a foreign country. You are trying to make your life better. You are the first person. Nobody is there for you. You don't have somebody who is from the family there to support you. You don't have friends over here who can support you. They don't even speak your language. You can't even convey your, like, at least the people who are living in English speaking countries as a South Asian diaspora, you have a privilege of speaking English language, even if you have moved out of your original countries. I don't. I had to learn the language first to express myself. How do I feel about it? So, but fortunately, I'm a very fortunate person. I must say that. I have friends here. I have a new family here who loves me, who support me for who I am. And before I came out as an LGBTI person, I came out as an ex-Muslim. And that was also very hard. That hit hard really among my friends. And I think you get shunned from all parts of the society, from your students. I used to be a teacher, to people who are your friends and who used to drink with you alcohol, and they're calling you a sinner. And I'm like laughing. Okay, so being an LGBTI person is worse sin than being an alcoholic. I don't know. Like, how do you even calibrate all those sins? Do you measure the amount of sin, or what? How do you do that? Like, it never made any sense to me. So, but now even it is happening with me, because now I am on the very upfront, or the front lines, as you say in English, and talking about the rights of LGBTI people, talking about the rights of ex-Muslim. I do get backlash even from LGBTI community who are Muslims, and lately there were even incidents where people said, I'm not allowed to work for LGBTI Muslims because I'm an ex-Muslim. I shouldn't be allowed to work with them. And I was like, listen, I'm not preaching my religion here. I'm not, ex-Muslim is my identity. So is being an LGBTI person my identity. And I'm working for the LGBTI people and not for the ex-Muslims or Muslims. I don't care if you are a Christian, if you are ex-Muslim, if you are a Jew, if you are a Hindu. I'm helping you to come and live in this country according to the legal situations, whatever the laws are applicable on you. And that's where I am helping you to get your due rights in this country. Because Germany is one of those countries where the getting asylum is actually a constitutional right. So everybody has a right to come to Germany and apply for an asylum. So it's a remarkable thing. Not all countries have that. And one last thing about US, Nemat said something about the ambassador, and we made jokes about it. Even in Germany, we were like, what? If you look at the United States of America, it's still not dark blue. Mexico is.
Mexico is more
is light blue, and light blue means here you have a lot of protection, and dark blue means you have constitutional protection. So Mexico is giving constitutional protection to the LGB, and US is not. So there are so many disparities, and there are so many paradoxes when you talk about LGBTI people coming from different countries of origin. Like, what is actually is, you can talk about anything. Look at Poland, what Poland is doing. They are Catholics. Catholic majority country, and we have now people from Poland contacting us. How can I come to Germany and stay there? They are EU citizens. Hungary lately took right from trans people to change their names and their gender marker through constitutional right. Like, this is so absurd. Everything, like, if you are going to involve religious people who are fanatics, I must say that, and who think that all the verses in the Bible or in the Quran, whatever their interpretation is, I'm not going deep into that conversation, and give them the power, they will ruin you. You need to have people who can be very partial, who are very much objective, and who are working for human beings, regardless of anything they have. And this thing, the throwing throwing all these terminologies, you're Islamophobic, you're homophobic, you are this phobic, you are that phobic, it's never going to help anyone. If you really want to do something, it doesn't matter if you're a Muslim or an ex-Muslim. If you're an LGBTI person, you have to come into power and you have to change the policies. Otherwise, anybody coming into power will step on top of us, on our faces, and take all the rights away from us, even in countries like European countries. Thank you.
All right, to pass the conversation to Saima before we get a final statement from Nemat.
Really powerful. So what I was going to say is, when we think about shunning, we have to really respect that that means different variances of, shunning, I guess. So, some people might have a more extreme effect and some people might not, but it still has its consequences. So if I use my own lived experience as an example, I'm a very privileged person, because my family have accepted me, even those members of the family or extended family or the community that may disagree or have differences of opinion can't say anything, because my immediate family haven't shunned me. And even the conservative members of my family who may have disagreed at times or when they first saw me on the news have still not stopped me having relationships with their kids, etc. I think we have to recognize that shunning has different consequences for different people, but I think what we have to pay focus on is the catastrophic consequences it has on people, the extreme cases. And by recognizing that, then we need to start creating safe spaces, and it shouldn't be a case of, oh, this is a space for people with faith and this is a space for people without faith, or people who drink and people who don't drink. We're all LGBTQI people. We all have shared struggles, and it's time that we united on these struggles and recognize all those struggles. Now, also, recognizing privilege, there's nothing negative in recognizing privilege, because at some point in life, there's always going to be someone worse off. So we all have to recognize that. But it's by recognizing your privileges that you can then utilize them to take this argument into the media, into the public eye. I think also, when it comes to shunning and the extreme cases, we have to really, really pay attention to the catastrophic effects on mental health. And of course, that extreme case is suicide. So, this all needs to be part of our organizing as a collective. And like Nemat said earlier, very good point. You said you wrote a book and then, you were getting targeted hate from one community, targeting hate from another community. Now, I've had the same. I'm not going to go into detail. I've only been in the limelight for a year, but I've had some very extreme things that have happened. So I think what we need to remember as activists in the public eye, and like yourself, Nemat, is that you might do great things, and but there's always going to be someone who might have done it before and they might not have had the limelight. So what you do then is you use your privilege and you say, okay, well, how can I help you? How can I elevate your story? Okay, if it's not a safe environment for you, should I share your story? So I guess it's a case of just reaching out to everyone. One of the most wonderful things that's happened in the last year for me is people of faith and non-faith, predominantly South Asian people from all over the world, have contacted me and spoken about the shared struggle. you know, and we have that shared struggle. So we must always remember, before anything else, we're LGBTQI people, and it's that shared struggle that's going to unite us. And if we can't see that, nothing's ever going to change. I'll stop there.
All right, Nemat, if you've got anything to add to that, and then we'll maybe have final comments before we move on to the Q&A section of the show. You're muted.
Yeah, so that's great. Thank you, Saima. Yeah, and it's interesting because we are making progress. Look, my novel, The Carpet Weaver, is now a bestseller. It's gotten a lot of people in India have found out about it. I really worried the fact that my main character, because it rolled out right after the Penal Code Section 377, and the country is just in transition, and I think they just legalized same-sex relations. So I was worried that I would get backlash from Muslim community members of the Muslim community for portraying a gay ex-Muslim character. On the contrary, I've gone to book fairs and lit fest, and I've had hijabi Muslim women and their husbands buy the book, or they've read the book and they wanted me to sign it and personalize it and take selfies with them. And mind you that there is a difference, because Indian Muslims have lived in coexistence for many years with other faith groups. They haven't lived under a dictatorship. So there's a little bit more openness, and ideas of pluralism is more acceptable within the Muslim community by and large there. But what I will say is that telling me that, you know, the controversy is like why my book has become so successful in terms of LGBT novel, that it's kind of like taking away the spotlight from LGBT Indian books. And the criticism has been that I'm not fighting LGBT rights in Afghanistan the way a proper activist should. And I tell them, by all means, if you think that you can fight LGBT rights in Afghanistan or Muslim communities better than I can, go for it. I'm willing to support you and help you. But it's just, like you said, they're just trying to like find nitpick anything. So, you know, we're in a position of power. We think that we're getting attacked from all sides, but actually we are kind of like the crusaders for free speech on this planet right now. Whether you're Muslim reformist or ex-Muslim or LGBT Muslim or LGBT ex-Muslim, we're really pushing the envelope. We're pushing the frontiers of progress for many peoples on this planet. So I think that we're in a privileged position. We should never think of ourselves as being shunned and persecuted. That's just one narrative. I think that we should also look at ourselves as being in a position of power, as being in a position of being change agents. And you're right, we have to be more inclusive, and I'm mindful of that. So my whole thing is, one more thing I wanted to say is that in the United States, it's not just been the Trump administration. You know, the President Barack Obama appointed his first LGBT envoy as an ambassador to go throughout the world. And I reached out to him at an event. I brought him, I said, look, I feel like I have the whole weight of the gay world on my back, especially the gay Muslim world, because no one is helping me. And I told him, and he, you know what his response was to me at this event, which was the Victory Institute event? He said, you know what, at the end of the day, LGBT community within Muslim countries have to bring their own change. And, you know, this was a big slap in the face to me, because it's like, then why are you in my homeland and occupying it for 20 years? And why are you trying to create, the only time the Western media is interested in having me or other LGBT members from Afghanistan have a voice and want me to connect with them, is when they're wanting to do a story on pederasty or pedophilia. No, these are two separate issues. If you want to know about pederasty or pedophilia, go talk to the author of The Kite Runner. Go talk to the many journalists and many human rights experts who are, I mean, I'm against pedophilia too. But, you know, but the thing is like, when in the Western world, in which Western country did we lump pederasty and pedophilia with LGBTQI rights? So we need to make sure that we put in our Western narratives that we have in our respective Western countries, that we educate people, say, look, you never have had in Germany, in the UK, in the US, LGBTQI rights lumped into this whole thing. So we need to make sure that we get control of the narrative. Because if we're not control of the narrative, we let other people define us, then we're never going to make progress within our communities.
Are there any final comments to put through? Everybody's great. I thought that was a great place stop anyway. So thank you for all of the statements from all of our speakers. We are going to move on to Q&A. I have noticed that there are quite a few questions that I don't feel are constructive. So Maryam,
one of the questions that was from YouTube, I think from Esther Rivetter, when people say that
I've got Maryam to curate the ones that I do think are constructive. So I would like to invite, so Nemat wanted to answer this question, and I would like to invite Khakan back on to talk about it as well, because I think it's an interesting discussion to have. And the question is, Esther Vondu Ridder has said, I'm a bit allergic to it's not Islam, it's people argument. Where do the people get their ideas and beliefs from? At the very least, Islam bears a responsibility for what believers take away from the scripture, hadith, etc. So can we have Khakan talk about this first, and then Nemat can comment following?
Hello, I'm glad to be back. I think what we need to look at is, the scriptures and who, as I said before, who is the source of these scriptures. For a lot of the time when we talk about the Quran, as I said, a number of people, in my experience over the last 50 years, they haven't really read the Quran, or they don't really understand it as well. And so a lot of the information is misinformation, and a lot of people are going through what we would call social conditioning or indoctrination as well, especially when it comes down to how the LGBT community is treated by the so-called Islamic community. So when people are saying it's the Islam is saying they are anti-LGBT, that's incorrect. As I said, when I was coming out, I read page to page of the Quran, and I referenced the story of Lut and what it meant to me as well. So I put it into historical context and social context, and I took away from it that, I'm okay. I'm a gay, authentic Muslim man. I identify as Muslim time and time again because I follow the scriptures of Islam in that Quran that I read. Now, I've read many other scriptures as well and interpretations. A number of people are vehemently anti-LGBT in that particular interpretation. And again, it will depend on which source or which part of the world you pick up that translation from as well. The book that I read when I was coming out was about 30 years ago, and that was a really good one. And the language that was used was almost Shakespearean. It was very difficult to understand, but I plowed through it and I tried to make sense of it. But even now, we have much more what I call commercial or much more savvy interpretations, and they are very much dominated by anti-LGBT rhetoric. And I keep saying, what is the source? Where is it coming from? One of the interpretations that I picked up happened to be from Alam Rock, and that is an area where the LGBT protest started from. So again, it's about who's populating it, who's giving that information, and how that is being taken and used either as a tool for good, i.e. if you're an authentic Muslim and you're using it for positivity, or you're trying to create divisions. And a lot of the time, unfortunately, there's people out there who are determined, like someone said earlier about Trump creating divisions. We've got Boris Johnson here creating divisions, and people think it gives them status and power to create divisions because it elevates their status. And it's unfortunate, really, because we as LGBT activists, whether we're brown or South Asian or Muslim or not, we are trying to unite people time and time again. It's unfortunate that we do not have the platform or that media to do that. And some of us, we are activists behind the scenes. Some of us are at the forefront of it all. But no matter what we do, we are still sort of shunned as well, whether we are Muslim or LGBT or not. And I think it's really important that, we say throughout this whole discussion tonight that we try to unite as much as possible and stop saying, you're LGBT Muslim or you're ex-Muslim. At the end of the day, I keep saying time and time again, we are Muslims, we are humans, and we have to be respected and understood as individuals in order to move forward. And identities play an important part in who we are as well. And, I hope that in another 20 years, that people can reunite and drop down the barriers and create binds instead.
Thank you for that, Khakan. So I'm going to have Nemat comment on that question. If you need me to repeat it, I will. Ludovic, I think, also wants to comment on this, so feel free to jump in after Nemat. I have a feeling Jimmy also wants to comment on it, but I can't see his face, so I can't pick up the social cues just yet. But Nemat, please feel free to answer that question. You're muted.
Yeah, this question from Esther Van der Ritter about, it's not the whole Islam, it's the people behind it. I've had this trouble too, not just in my engagement with Muslims in Afghanistan, but even the African American community here that identifies as with Islam. They also have basically told me, look, it's not that, it's the colonial buggery laws, it's this, it's that, it's the legacy of what the British did in that part of the world and other European powers. Those sodomy laws are the remnants of it. I said, okay, great. Why are you being so defensive for the Muslim ruling elite? If they got their independence, then they should scrap those buggery laws, right? So they're clearly still not independent then. They're still, so they're using those things for their own personal, whether it's the buggery. Of course, we know that we talked in our earlier session today that those buggery laws exacerbated the problem. But let's not kid ourselves. The problem with homophobia preceded colonialism in Muslim majority world, okay? And if anybody wants to create a fantasy and create a thing that we lived in this great glorious paradise, I'm sorry, that's just a myth. It's not, I wouldn't even count that as, that's a terrible dose of science fiction that I'm not going to sign up for. So what I would want to say is, like, let's take the conversation forward. Like, I had a discussion, the first ever BBC discussion. It was moderated by BBC Pashto. We had a discussion where I was this debating Islam and homosexuality from a secular scientific point of view. There was a mullah that was taking a very strict Sharia stance, and there was a mediator, Islamic scholar in the UK, and we were having this discussion. And basically, we were like three alternate universes. Like, we were not finding, but it was a cordial conversation. At least we had this conversation because, before I had come out, gays did not even exist in Afghanistan. They were like what Ahmadinejad set up when he came to Columbia University and said, gays just don't exist. That's where the conversation was. And we've created through, liberal constructivism, not just me, but other members of LGBT community from Afghanistan who've come out in the diaspora, who've also have been bringing change within our community. And the same thing is happening with people from other ethnic and national origins within the Muslim communities. So these things are happening. So I think we need to not be regressive and I think we shouldn't go back to the past only. We should look for a way into the future and imagining a future where we can be inclusive. And that's why I do believe, to answer this question, I think what you're trying to do is try to get on the good side of Muslims by saying, oh, no, it's not those belief systems. But that's never going to work, because it's not, why are we trying to curry favor with them to like us when they think we shouldn't even exist? When they think apostates and homosexuals should just be killed? You can't have that conversation. I'm not going to talk to you. If you don't think I should exist or other people like me, to make you feel good about your belief system, I'm not going to sit here and entertain that conversation. That's not a good starting point.
All right. I want to give voice to Ludovic first, and then I will jump to Jimmy, just because first come, first serve, and he did jump in first. Ludovic, what are your thoughts on the notion it's not Islam, it's the people argument?
Yeah, but we're turning around the pot, but it is Islam. So Jimmy is going to tell me that it's too complex once again. I've been told that before, and it is, but it is Islam and it is not Islam. It is Islam because factually, historically, politically, this is what Islam is used to do for. And like my spiritual aunt, Amina Wadud from California used to say, Islam is peace and Islam is terrorism. Islam is everything you want it to be because we're creating Islam. Especially if you don't believe in God, that's even easier because there's no God. There's only us. So we are creating those dynamics, those beliefs, those traditions. So that's from an anthropological point of view, that's wonderful. But at the same time, sometimes we fool ourselves, and because we reject it and we say, oh, it's too hard, we cannot assume the fact that it's us. No, it's us. We are beasts inside. We're killing one another to survive in times of crisis. So yes, it is Islam that we created that way nowadays. And it was not Islam maybe a few centuries ago because it has been influenced by other factors. So another point is that I never used the golden age expression. It has been used several times to sustain it, to criticize it. Yes, I think that it's also a construction, an illusion, a reification, attributing to a certain history, a certain religion, certain culture, like a soul, like it is alive, it does speak, and so on. So I don't idealize that period of Islam, because it was maybe more powerful and less subject to hysteria and paranoia and discriminating, state homophobia, and so on and so forth. But of course, those problems existed because it was they are part of ourselves, discriminating minorities and putting all the power between the hands of those who are more physically powerful. So this is human nature. And I would say, to continue on that, that even if it would have been written black and white in the Quran, homosexuality is haram, which is not the case. It's always about rape, non-consenting relationships, whatever. So it's important to reappropriate those texts, but the text is nothing without the context, just like statistics, history, politics, whatever. So even if it would have been written black and white that homosexuality is haram, a perversion, it would have been there. Thought about homosexuality 14 centuries ago. I'm not really concerned because I'm not there anymore. I'm living here and now. And the last point was about, I don't know if you hear me again? Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You hear me?
Yep.
Hello?
Yep.
Yeah, sorry. No. So, yeah, I really think that it's important to remember that the culture breathes. It's Imam Dai Abdullah from USA, Washington, who said that in a conference in South Africa a few years ago. I thought it was brilliant, because a culture, religion, a society breathes. Otherwise, it dies, it collapses. And we have to understand that we have the power, in a way or another, even as LGBT plus minorities or ethnical minorities, to have our word to say about what are the limits to religion in our societies, especially in democratic, postmodern Western societies. How do we see Islam? What is the place for Islam and other religions? For example, I've been fighting for years to forbid homophobic, anti-Semitic, and misogynistic interpretations of the Quran. There's some verses that are saying you can beat women, kill homosexuals. No, yeah, you don't have to say it. It's forbidden, full stop, because it's not a freedom of consciousness or religion. It's about, once again, hatred, fascism, and so on and so forth.
Okay.
You know, one line, I've been to Mecca 5 times. The last time I've been there, I saw by random, by coincidence, Quran translated in French, and I've seen after Sodom and Gomorrah and the brackets, the city of homosexuals. So those who are changing the texts to prove that they're right, to forcing that interpretation, is those bigots, not us.
Okay. I'm being asked to wrap it up because we do want to finish at 8 o'clock.
I need to come back. I need to come back to that long soliloquy of obfuscation. I have to.
We will, and you will be allowed to make your points, but I just want to say that your points should be compounded with your last and final statements. So the last and final statements should be around surviving and resisting as LGBT people, as ex-Muslims, as Muslim LGBT people. So I would like to start that phase, but Jimmy, please do feel free to respond, but we do want to wrap up by 8, and Maryam wants to give a final conclusion. So go ahead.
I just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been even more of an absolute pleasure because we had Muslim people here. It's really just contributed to this so uniquely. So I just want to respond. Any Muslim person or any person of Muslim heritage, so Muslim or ex-Muslim, anybody worth their salt from our community who's of Muslim heritage would have heard the phrase, "Islam is perfect, Muslims are not." Yeah. And that is the ethos of Islamic communities internationally. This perspective that Ludovic has of, we are Islam, Islam is this esoteric thing. Actually, no, the mainstream interpretation of Islam is this is the jurisprudence, this is the hadith, this is the Quran. If you don't align yourself to this, you're some freak sect like Sunnis or Shias like Sufis or Shias out there, or you're an even bigger freak sect like the Ahmadi, who we should all just really kill and not give passports to in Pakistan. Yeah. So I think let's be really honest about this. Like, Islam is perfect, Muslims are not. Until we can get the Muslim community to a point to say, this book is not perfect, it's actually pretty hideous. It's got a verse in there that tells you how you can beat your wife, that generated scholastic debate around the appropriate way to beat your wife. Is it with a toothpick? Is it with your hand? Is it with a whip? Should you leave a mark? Should you not leave a mark? Under what circumstances can you beat your wife? It talks about torturing people in hell for all eternity, even though they might have just failed a test that was 100 years old. They're going to be tortured for the rest of eternity. Like, this is a hideous book. It has a lot of ugly in there. Defining that as perfect warps the perspective of an entire community around what the definition of perfect is. And it doesn't allow you to progress, because if your default position is that this book is perfect, this book that tells you to beat your wife is perfect. Just imagine how much that screws up a community's perspective on progress and perfection. As for resisting and surviving, I'll leave that to everybody else.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Jimmy. Saima, let's have your thoughts on the last topic and your final statement.
I don't know where to start. I'll just start on the survival and resisting. I think, like I've said, and many other people have said, we really need to put our differences aside, maybe our political opinions aside, and we need to unite. We need to unite with the Black Lives Movement. They need our support more than ever. And, there's colorism within the South Asian community, and we really need to get with the causes that need our help. But also at the same time, as LGBTQI people of faith and no faith, we should unite. And again, even in this forum, we've got so many differences of opinion. I'm not going to go into that debate. I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to go down that debate. But at the same time, we do need to put our differences aside. And now is the time. Now is the time to act. And for me, it's the political movement. So what are we going to do to change those red countries behind Lilith to a different color, and how are we...
ones, to be honest.
Sorry, say again?
Even the pale blue ones, to be honest.
All of them, right? Yeah. I don't actually know what the color key is, but you get the point I'm making, right? We need to change things, but we need to change them internationally. And, I'm happy to reach out with anyone who wants to go down that political route, because we really need to understand the politics in each country before we can start dismantling them. So, yeah, thank you very much for having me here.
Khakan, welcome back, and feel free to comment on the previous issue as well as your final statement.
Well, I would strongly disagree with Jimmy on that. The Quran is an ugly book. I would actually say it's a very beautiful book. I'm not an academic or a scholar, and to be honest, I wouldn't recommend any ordinary person out there to go to a scholar or an academic person to translate it for them. I would say go and read it yourself and research, because for me, it's about looking at the subtext, the themes and the issues that the Quran carries. It looks at women's rights, equality, the treatment of people who are disabled, the vulnerable, the marginalized. We need to look at those aspects of humanity as well. And also, I think I'm crying out for a gay Asian revolution, similar to Stonewall, but obviously not with throwing the bricks or anything. But I really do think that as activists, as campaigners, as an LGBT community, whether we are ex-Muslim or not, that we do come together to unify. It happened a couple of years back at London Pride 2017. I would like to see that duplicated time and time again across the cities, across the world, that as LGBT Muslims or ex-Muslims, that we do unite, even as the whole South Asian diaspora, to show that we are here and we have been existing since the millennia, and we will continue to exist. And whether, we are being persecuted or oppressed, we have to find a way to become much more robust and resilient in fighting our causes, in sharing our stories, in being much more visible and vocal. I love the fact that there are people here who are writers, who are trans, who are Pakistani, who are, mixed heritage or whatever. I love the fact that this platform gave us all the opportunity to come together and just talk, share opinions and views. And as I said, I want my hashtag Asian revolution to happen soon.
Thank you, and thank you for coming on. It's been a really, really insightful conversation having you here. Lilith, let's have your final statements and maybe comments on the last topic if you feel like you want to.
So I have like 4 statements, not last. They are like 4 different points, but I will try to sum them up in one statement. And then I have 1 point on resisting and surviving. And the last thing I will like to speak to first, we must look at the privileges. Who are we? Where are we sitting? And the privilege to show our faces to the world. How many LGBTI Muslims, ex-Muslims, sitting in countries where majority draconian laws derived from Sharia law, or whatever the countries they are here present on this platform and able to show their faces. This is the privilege we are talking about, first of all. Secondly, I disagree with so many things, and I have a right to disagree to them because they are all ideas and they are all views. Your sexuality and your gender identity is neither an idea nor a view. So please, we have to make that difference. I am born like this, as the Lady Gaga used to say, born this way. So we are born this way. But born in a Muslim country or in a Christian country, it's just a probability, chance. If our parents didn't choose to have unsafe sex or without any condom or without any pills, we wouldn't be existing. Come on. I'm blunt about it.
It's so good.
It is. Let's not confuse things. It was a lot of confusion at the end with the final statements. I'm sorry if I'm like...
So good. Keep going.
I'm sorry about it, but it is the way it is. I have a privilege to show my face sitting in this platform because I live in Germany. If I were in Pakistan, I won't be able to show my face. Hello, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
These are the privileges we have because of the democracy, because of the laws in place, and because of the support that we get from structures and from people who are with us. One thing. Secondly, Islam versus women. Islam versus Muslims. Word of God. And Islam, is it just Quran or is it also the Hadith? Because all these Muslims saying, I'm Muslim, I'm Muslim, I'm Muslim, and in Quran it doesn't say anywhere to kill gays. It doesn't. I know. I have read Quran as well. But in Quran it doesn't also say anywhere how to pray, how to offer your prayer. It's all from Hadith. Similarly, killing gay people is also in Hadith. So are you either going to stick to the Quran and become the Quranist Islamist, or you're going to stick to the traditions and offer your prayers, do your wudu, and then go for prayers? Tell me, where is it to go and do your wudu? And the last thing, as long as any scripture on this planet, it doesn't matter which religion, is going to be held up as word of God, forget about any unity. Because word of God means the God wants that. And it's your God. Excuse me, it's not mine. Don't imply your God on me. I'm not going to take that bullshit from you. And I have a right to discuss your God, and I have a right to discuss about your God because your God is interfering in more than 72 countries where people live. And last but not the least, resisting and surviving. We can only resist when we agree to the point that there are problems within the religion. There are very critical problems within the religion, and how you define religion, it is also different from place to place. So you can't resist without having the common platform. You have to have a common platform to resist about it. You can all praise your Allah. You can all praise your Jesus. You can all praise your Jehovah. You can all praise your Yahweh. I don't care. You can praise your Krishna and sing Hare Rama, Hare Krishna all along the roads you want to, but that's not how it is. That's not how the real world works. The real world works in a very different way, and we have to resist on the same platform. I'm a human. I need my rights as my gender identity, as my sexual orientation, and I don't care if you go and bow down to a wall, or you circle around a box, or you ring the bells. I don't care. It's your private life. Keep it inside your home. Don't tell me what to do with my life. So that's very clear thing. And then if we have this platform where we can all resist together, then comes the second step, which is surviving. Then we will have the survival. Otherwise, the survival, we know how it works. It's for the fittest and for the best. That's also the law of the nature. So either you become the best or the fittest, or you become the person who give platform to everyone, and based not on their ideas, rather based on their persons. We call it based on your human being. I'm a Punjabi too, but I don't want my Punjabiism to be thrown everywhere. It's my thing. And if my Punjabiism doesn't get discriminated by the God, or doesn't get discriminated by any power that derives its laws and codes from any religion. I can speak all the languages I want to. It doesn't get discriminated by laws and religions. It's just my sex, whom I fuck and whom I get fucked with. Is that the thing? And how hideous it is that gods are controlling your sex life. They're watching. Are they all porn addicts or what? I'm sorry. Right. That's my last. Thank you. Okay. Thank you for giving me the space to talk today.
No problem. It is 8 o'clock, so we're going to try and wrap this up. Nemat, please give us your final statements. We've brought Khakan back just for balance, because I don't want to end on two ex-Muslims. So go ahead, Nemat. Please give us your final comments and your final words about survival. And sorry, I'll stop. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, I just want to say that, after World War II and the atrocities that were committed against Jews, homosexuals, and other so-called degenerates under Hitler's camps, we said never again, right? And that's just like a hashtag and a popular thing. But let's remember that in Chechnya for the last several years, there are concentration camps, and gay people are getting tortured and slaughtered to death. And they reinstituted stoning, and it's like, in about a dozen countries, if you look at them, that it's legalized with the death penalty. The vast and then there's about 70 countries around the world, and you see the common thread, which is Muslim majority countries. And and we cannot ignore the fact, yes, of course, colonialism played a role. They played a huge role in setting back the clock for LGBT rights and for other minority groups in these countries. But where is the conversation now? So we have to remember that LGBT people are minorities within minorities in the diaspora. So when we talk about intersectionality, yes, there are a lot of Muslims groups who are supporting, for example, Black Lives Matter, other civil rights things, women's rights, all these types of things, LGBT rights. But then within the Muslim diaspora community, LGBTQIA people, especially LGBTQIA ex-Muslim people, are extremely ostracized. And we've never been able, we've have to live in hiding. And even, Lilith said that we're privileged. I know gay and ex-Muslims who live in Western countries and they still don't show their faces. So we're privileged among the privileged, you know what I mean? So we have to remember that. And it's like the conversation also happens where like, oh, these Muslim countries, United States is a form of imperialism, US and predominantly UK. These countries, US especially, that promotes LGBTI rights and points at Muslim communities like, oh, you don't support LGBT rights. It's a way to further marginalize an already marginalized Muslim community. That may be the case that they're using as a political tool, but we have to also remember, and then they're like, oh, this is US imperialism in the sense that, by pointing out all of these horrific acts that happened in Muslim majority countries. It's just another way to show how backward Muslim people are by throwing LGBT people out from rooftops and stoning them and hanging them and lynching them and all these sorts of things. It's just a way to perpetuate that this narrative that Muslims are only prone to violence. No, Muslims are not only Muslims who are committing those atrocities are just like everybody else who's conditioned and brainwashed and deprived of their economic and social condition to be able to reach their full potential, and their whole other set of mental health issues that are in play, and we cannot deny this fact. So I think that in order to have an honest conversation, we cannot say, oh, let's leave Islam out of this equation. I think it's inclusive of this conversation. And I think I'm really happy here that I think that everybody in this conversation, we were able to have a robust, uninhibited, and wide open discussion. So I hope we can continue this. And I want to thank, Maryam Namazie's leadership for making this possible, for you, Faye. And that's all I wanted to say. And thank you very much.
Thank you. Khakan, final word, wisdom from our spearhead in the movement, and then we'll have Maryam for the final comment.
Basically, I just want to say is that, again, thank you very much for having me. But first of all, we need to really stop the generalizations of Muslims or ex-Muslims. That needs to stop, because we keep talking about unity and working together and looking at how we can progress. I think one of the main things here I've found through the whole discussion tonight is the generalizations that are being thrown around, about Muslim countries and Muslim people. I think that first and foremost needs to stop. We also need to look at the levels of acceptance we are showing one another as humans and having the right to do that. We need to look at how we express ourselves, how we accept ourselves and other people around us, because we're talking about persecution. But again, Nemat just said about ex-Muslim LGBT who are in hiding. What about the LGBT Muslims that I know and other people know who are in hiding, who are not wanting to come out as well for whatever reasons? So again, we need to be looking at that and working together, working hand in hand along that path to unity, and showing that, but for the grace of God, we are all human beings. And as one nation, we need to work together to make progress, because otherwise nothing's going to change. We're going to be throwing stones at each other continuously. I appreciate this platform. It's been a really great debate. And I think that we can continue moving forward, and talk to other LGBT Muslim organizations and ex-Muslim organizations, trying to create a platform and a panel whereby we're not sort of throwing generalizations, that we are being much more succinct about what we have to offer and about what is our ultimate goal together. What is it that we're all aiming for? And I think we can make some strides forward. I hope in about 10, 20 years that, people will be more united and much more considerate and respectful of one another.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. This was not the easiest discussion in the world, but I think we all managed to remain civil and calm, and it's wonderful. Welcome back, Maryam Namazie, for your final closing statements. Take it away.
Yes, thank you, Faye, for doing a fantastic job in chairing and managing this discussion. I want to thank all our speakers. They were really absolutely brilliant. And I think these discussions can be difficult, but they are really important to have. I do just want to end by saying that we have to always make a distinction between ideas and people. I think we can make generalizations about ideas, and about political movements, social movements, for example. But what we cannot do is make generalizations about people. And I think that is always important to remember. I think oftentimes when we criticize ideas, and after all, religion is just one other idea. It's sacred to some, but it's not sacred to those of us who are atheists and ex-Muslims. And so we have to recognize that criticism of ideas is not the same as attacking people or dehumanizing them, but there is real bigotry, dehumanization taking place, both against Muslims and ex-Muslims, migrants and others. The other point I want to make is that it is possible for us to work together for change, despite our differences in ideas. But I think at least from my perspective, there has to be a lot more openness from believers in giving non-believers the right and acknowledging the right and space and need to be able to be critical of ideas, even if they are sacred, even if they are taboo. And I think one of the things that we keep going back to is every time there's a criticism of religion, it becomes, there's this attempt to say, well, look, if you want us to work together, you've got to have more respect, and you've got to, be more careful in what you say. And I think if we agree that we can criticize ideas unrelentingly, unequivocally, in any way, shape, and form that we choose, but that we agree that we respect each other as human beings, that we fight for each other's rights and lives, and that we know very clearly that our rights and lives are linked. You cannot fight for the rights of Muslim LGBT without fighting for the rights of ex-Muslim LGBT. You cannot fight for the right to religion without fighting for the right to be free from religion, because these are all aspects of freedom of conscience. And I think, we are always willing to work with believers because we see the importance of working together. And, I'm really grateful to the believers who have come on this platform. I know it's not easy because we are a vilified group, and it does take some risk. I think we need to acknowledge that for Muslims to come and join us in platforms to discuss these ideas. So I think, that's something we're really grateful for. And I hope, and I do think every year we see more and more of us joining hands. And I think we need to do that. We're moving there. There's a lot of work to be done. And I just, want to say thank you for all that you do. And we're going to be seeing you, on the front lines until we win. And we will win because, what we're fighting for is something that is just a basic human need and a basic human right. So thank you.
But anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion. I have uncreated podcast. Thank you everyone for participating. And I hope that this is unit and discussion because that's the only way